The first time the car passed me, I hardly noticed it. The second time, I felt a little uneasy, and the fifth time, my heart was thumping so hard that I could hardly hear my own ragged breathing as I sat there in my broken-down sedan on that pitch-black stretch of highway. I am the storyteller, and I'm here to help you today. Before we begin, click the like button and subscribe to the channel. After days of networking and forced small talk, I was driving back from a business conference in Phoenix to Los Angeles to enjoy some solitude. It was just past midnight, and I was the only car on that desolate stretch of Highway 60 cutting through the Arizona desert. I remember thinking how beautiful the night was. The sky was a tapestry of stars unobscured by city lights, and a full moon bathed in light. My name is Alex, and until that night, I had never really given much thought to how vulnerable we are out there on the open road. The radio was playing an old Eagles song, and I was tapping my fingers on the steering wheel, feeling more at ease than I had in months when my car began to sputter. At first, I thought I had just hit a rough patch of road, but then the engine coughed, the dashboard lights began to flash, and I felt the car losing power. I was able to steer it onto the shoulder before it died completely, and the sudden silence was nearly deafening after the noise of the radio and engine. No. I muttered, turned the ignition key, but there was no click or even a click. I took out my phone, knowing that there would be no signal, so for a bit I just sat there trying to decide what to do. I had some water and snacks in the car, but no flashlight or flares. I knew there was a town about 30 miles ahead, but in this darkness, walking seemed like a bad idea, so my best option was to wait for another car to pass by and hope they would stop to help. That's when I noticed the headlights in my rearview mirror. Watching the car come, I activated my hazard lights and got out, waving my arms to attract their attention. However, the car didn't slow down. Instead, it sped past me, kicking up a cloud of dust that made me cough, and vanished into the night. I saw a dark sedan with taillights that faded into the night, but I was grateful for nothing. I complained as I got back into my car and tried the engine again, more out of hope than expectation, but it didn't work, so I leaned back in my seat to consider my next course of action. Headlights in my mirror again first gave me the impression that it was another car, but as it approached, I realized with a start that it was the same dark sedan that had driven by me before it was returning. My heart leaped. Perhaps they had recognized my predicament and turned around to assist, but once more the car sped past without slowing down, though this time I could swear it slowed down a little as it passed me. It might have been a coincidence, but something felt strange, and I locked my doors abruptly. 10 minutes after 15, I was beginning to feel as though I had overreacted when I saw those headlights again. The same car was returning for a third pass, and this time there was no doubt that it slowed considerably as it approached close enough that I could make out the silhouette of a driver alone in the car. Before I could get a good look, it sped up again, disappearing into the night from my palms. I was aware of how exposed I was out here. The desert, which had seemed so beautiful earlier, now felt vast and menacing, with every shadow appearing as though it might be concealing something or someone. We're sweating now, and my heart is pounding. This isn't normal behavior. Nobody drives on an empty highway in the middle of the night unless they're searching for something or someone. I tried my phone again, but there was no signal. I considered trying to flag down the next car that went by, but the thought of getting out of my car seemed terrifying. What if it was the sedan again? What if it stopped? The minutes crawled by, feeling like an hour, and I jumped at every sound. The creak of the cooling engine, the whisper. I didn't have to wait long for the fourth time the sedan came along. This time it slowed to a crawl as it passed me. I squirmed in my seat, trying to make myself as small as possible because of the glare of the headlights, and I could see the driver turning his head to look at me as he went by. At that moment, I was positive that whatever was going on wasn't good and that whoever it was had singled me out and was playing with me. As soon as the car drove by, I decided that I had to leave even if it meant walking because it had to be safer than sitting here waiting for whatever was going on to happen. I took a deep breath, grabbed my phone and the bottle of water from the cup holder, and opened my car door. The desert night was cool against my skin and there was complete silence. I began walking along the shoulder of the road, my eyes darting from the path ahead to the road behind. The car was approaching, so I threw myself down on the side of the road, pressing my body into a shallow ditch. I held my breath as the sedan approached, hoping it would pass by, but it didn't, and I heard the crunch of tires on gravel as it pulled onto the shoulder right next to me. I had probably gone about half a mile when I saw the headlights again, and my stomach dropped. It was coming back faster this time. All I could see was flat desert stretching out on either side of the highway. The car engine slowed down where I was hiding, then stopped. A car door opened and closed, and I squeezed my eyes shut, my entire body shaking. This was it, whatever sick game this person had been playing, and it was about to end. "Hello, are you okay down there?" The voice was female and worried, which was completely unexpected. When I opened my eyes, I saw a middle-aged woman looking down at me with a flashlight in her hand. I was too shocked to speak clearly, so she offered me a hand. "We got a call about a broken-down car, but it took me a while to find you. Are you hurt?" She helped me up, and when I finally saw her car, I realized it was a highway patrol SUV rather than a dark sedan. I was still trying to comprehend what was happening, so I kept driving past you, but you nodded. "I was looking for you, and since your car was empty, I knew you must have started to walk, so I made a few passes to try to find you on the road." The sound that came over me was so intense that it made my knees weak, and I found myself laughing. It was almost hysterical. Officer Sarah, who was very kind based on her name tag, drove me back to my car, called a tow truck, and waited for it to arrive. We sat in her warm war SUV, and she explained that this section of highway was notorious for disrupting cell signals. She had seen many panicked drivers over the years, and she explained that the desert at night can play tricks on your mind. As I watched my car being loaded onto the tow truck, I experienced a mixture of uneasiness and embarrassment. I knew Sarah was right. I had allowed my imagination to run wild, turning a good deed into a nightmare, but I couldn't get rid of the memory of that fear and the absolute certainty that I was in danger. Months have passed since that night, and I still think about it frequently. I've driven that section of highway multiple times since then, always in the daylight and always with a full tank of petrol and a charged phone, and every time I say a silent thank you to Sarah, the highway patrol officer who unwittingly saved me from my own fears. I still check my rearview mirror a bit more frequently than I should on dark nights when I'm driving alone because, in reality, you never know what's out there on those long, lonely roads, and sometimes the greatest danger isn't what lurks in the shadows, but rather the shadows our own minds create. The shovel struck something hard, sending a jolt up my arms, and I stopped. Wiping perspiration from my forehead with a muddy hand, I called down to my son Jake, who was working next to me in the hole. "Hey, grab the flashlight, will you?" I thought we had hit something, but I had no idea that metallic clang would be the sound that changed everything. I had inherited this farm from my uncle 6 months prior. It was a fixer-upper, to put it mildly, but it was a chance for a new beginning after the divorce, so Jake and I threw ourselves into the work. Fixing fences, repairing the barn, and now digging a new well because the old one had run dry years ago and we needed water. If we were going to succeed here, Jake showed us the flashlight where my shovel had struck, and the beam reflected off something smooth and metallic, which contrasted sharply with the dark earth around it. "What is that, Dad?" Jake asked in a voice that was a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. I shrugged, already scraping away more dirt with my hands. "I don't know, buddy, let's find out." As we dug, the object started to take shape. It was a metal container it was the size of a small suitcase, and its once glossy surface was now pitted and corroded. My mind was racing with potential ideas, such as a time capsule containing treasure or simply some farmer's trash thrown in a hole and forgotten. It took an additional hour of careful digging to remove the container from the ground, and by the time we emerged from the well, the sun was setting and casting long shadows across the field. We carried our find back to the barn, both of us silent, lost in our own thoughts about what might be inside under the barn's harsh glare. Floodlights, I looked more closely at the container. It was tightly sealed and there was no obvious way to open it. A faded inscription was barely visible on one side, but years of corrosion had rendered it unreadable. Should we open it? Jake asked, practically jumping with excitement. I hesitated for a moment, thinking that maybe I should call the police or a lawyer, but curiosity won out. Okay, I said, reaching for a crowbar stand back. It took some work, but eventually the lid creaked open and the smell hit us first, musty and damp like a stack of documents and photos was stored in an old cellar that was shielded by layers of waxy paper. I picked up the first picture and held it up to the light. It showed a young woman who was probably in her early 20s smiling at the camera. Based on her attire and hairstyle, the picture was likely from the 1960s. I turned it over, and on the back, in faded ink, it said, Sarah Milligan 1964. Jake looked over my shoulder, and I shook my head. Who's that, Dad? I didn't know, but as I said it, a nagging feeling began in the pit of my stomach. We spent the next hour going through the contents of the box because it was familiar, but I couldn't place why. There were more pictures of the same young woman, Sarah, taken at different locations around what appeared to be this very farm. There were also letters, newspaper clippings, and a small leather-bound journal. As I turned through the journal, a yellowed newspaper clipping fell out and the headline made my blood run cold. 3 months later, the local woman was still missing, and I read the article quickly, my heart racing. Jake's voice brought me back to the present. I looked at my son, trying to keep my voice steady. Jake, I think we just found evidence in a very old missing persons case. His eyes widened, really like a real mystery. I nodded, my mind racing. Yes, buddy, a real mystery. In the summer of 1964, despite a thorough search, no trace of her was ever found. The article stated that Sarah's father, the farm's owner, was the main suspect but was never charged due to a lack of evidence. When things finally calmed down, it was past midnight, and Jake and I were questioned separately, recounting how we had found the box. The box and its contents had been taken away as evidence, and we had been told not to discuss the case with anyone, as if we knew anyone to discuss it with, since we were still new in the area. They're more than necessary, so we need to call the police. The next few hours were a blur. Deputies came out to the farm, followed by detectives and a crime scene unit. The next morning, I drove into town determined to do some research of my own. The local library was small, but it had archives of the town's newspaper going back decades, so I spent hours poring over microfiche, reading everything I could. The town barely knew our neighbors, so I put Jake to bed, his head full of excitement about our discovery, but sleep eluded me. I sat at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee in front of me, staring out at the darkened fields, wondering what had happened to Sarah Milligan and why her name sounded so familiar. As I read the details of the Milligan case, I began to realize why Sarah's name had sounded familiar. My mother had mentioned her once years ago, a cousin who had gone missing before I was, and Sarah was 23 when she disappeared. She was engaged to be married, and her fiancé had reported her missing when she failed to show up for a date. Her father, James Milligan, claimed she had left the farm to run errands in town. When I got home, I saw a police car in the driveway. Detective Reeves, the lead investigator, was waiting for me, Mr. Collins. She said, when I get out of my truck, we need to talk. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd spent a restless night. Detective Reeves didn't waste time on small talk. "We've identified the DNA on some of the items in the box," she said, her eyes welling. "Sarah Milligan's name matches mine, and we're treating this as a homicide investigation." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, but I had to ask, "Did you know anything about this before you found that box?" I shook my head emphatically. "No, absolutely not. I inherited this farm from my uncle 6 months ago, and I never even met him." She raised an eyebrow, so I took a deep breath. "James Milligan, Sarah's father." Detective Reeves leaned back, surprised that you're related to the Milligans. I only just learned, but as I spoke, I could see the detective's mind working. "Mr. Collins, I'm going to be honest with you," she said. "When I'm done, this complicates things. We're going to need to do a thorough search of the property, and I'm afraid you and your son might need to find somewhere else to stay for a while." I nodded, feeling numb. "Of course, whatever you need." The next few weeks were a nightmare. The farm turned into a crime scene, with police and forensic teams searching every inch of the property. Jake and I moved into a motel. I tried to shield Jake from the worst of it, but it was impossible to keep him from seeing everything. He was old enough to comprehend the fundamentals of what was happening, and his initial excitement about solving a mystery had vanished. In town, I watched from a distance as our new home was being torn apart in search of evidence. The story first appeared on the local news, then went national. Suddenly, our sleepy little town was overrun with reporters and true crime fans who wanted to know about the mysterious box about Sarah Milligan, the farmer who had inherited a decades-old secret. As the investigation progressed, more information surfaced, old case files were reopened, witnesses were reined in, and a sad picture emerged of Sarah wanting to leave the farm to start a life with her fiancé, James Milligan, who had opposed the marriage. Jake was the one who asked the question I'd been avoiding. "Dad, do you think Uncle James did it? Do you think he killed Sarah?" I pulled him close, wishing I had a better answer. Wishing Sarah to stay and assist in running the family business, but there was no confession, no smoking gun, just a lot of circumstantial evidence and a family split apart by secrets and suspicion. Eventually, after almost 2 months, we were permitted to return to the farm because the police had not discovered any additional evidence, and as long as the investigation was ongoing, they had no reason to bar us from our house. The farm felt different now, and every rustle in the fields and creaking floorboards seemed to be a whisper of long-known secrets, so I started to avoid the area. I couldn't get rid of the feeling that we were living in the shadow of a tragedy as we returned to our routines. The farm that was supposed to be our fresh start now felt tainted and haunted by the echoes of the past. But we stayed partly because we had nowhere else to go, and partly because we felt obligated to Sarah to find the truth and tell her story after so many years of silence. I'm not sure if we'll ever know exactly what happened to Sarah Milligan. Every time I pick up a shovel now, I can't help but wonder what other secrets might be buried beneath our feet, and whether some things are better left undiscovered. The first time I saw the blue sedan, I didn't think much of it, but by the third time, my palms were sweating on the steering wheel, and by the fifth time, I was fighting the urge to scream what had happened. However, I do know that her story and the secrets of this farm are now a part of our lives, and somehow we'll find a way to live with that to honor her memory while building our own future on this land. Driving a blue sedan with my girlfriend, Alex, and up until 3 days ago, I thought I understood what fear was. I had been scared before, but every mile brought us closer to a confrontation I knew we couldn't avoid. As I looked into the rearview mirror for the 100th time and saw those now familiar headlights, I realized with chilling certainty that our past had caught up with us. Mia and I had been planning this cross-country road trip for months because we were both burned out from our jobs in New York and needed a break. The plan was to drive from New York to California. taking our time seeing the sights and reestablishing our relationship away from the stress of the city. The first 2 days were ideal. We ate too much junk food at roadside diners, sang along to corny pop songs, and marveled at how vast and beautiful the country truly was. That was new, and it all began with a car that just wouldn't go away. We stopped for gas about an hour later, and I saw the blue sedan pull into a pump across from us again. A lot of people need gas, so I didn't really notice it until we stopped for lunch at a diner in the middle of nowhere, Indiana. When I first saw the blue sedan, it was just a glimpse in my rearview mirror. A nondescript car, maybe a Toyota or Honda, a few cars behind us on the highway. Why would I think anything of it at the time? As we were driving away, I noticed that same blue car pull into the parking lot. The windows were tinted, so I couldn't see the driver, but something about it made my hair stand up. I told Mia, "Hey, does that blue car look familiar to you?" And she looked back before shrugging. Maybe it's a pretty common car, though probably just a coincidence. I tried to believe her, but I couldn't get rid of the uneasy feeling, so I increased my payment. The blue sedan F was always present at every rest stop and gas station whenever we pulled over to stretch our legs or take in a view. Mia could see how tense I was getting, so she said, "Alex, you're being paranoid." But I could hear the note of uncertainty in her voice. I was paying attention to the car in my mirrors, and sure enough, it was always there. A few cars behind us never got too close, but they never fell too far behind. By the time we crossed into Illinois, I was positive we were being followed. Answer for her. We were just a typical road trip couple, so who would want to follow us? But as we got closer to Chicago, I realized we were going to lose them. I told Mia, taking a sudden detour off the highway, "Alex, what are you doing?" She asked, clutching the dashboard as I made a sharp turn onto a side road. "Believe me," I said, my eyes darting constantly to the rearview mirror. "If they're really following us, we'll know for sure." Now, I drove us through a tangle of suburban streets, making unexpected turns. For a while, I thought we had lost them, but as we turned back onto a main road, I noticed the blue sedan still behind us. "Oh my God," Mia whispered. "You were right." Fear turned to resolve, and I stepped on the gas pedal, swerving through traffic and taking back roads and random exits. But no matter what I did, the blue sedan remained with us and was always in sight. As night fell, we found ourselves on a desolate two-lane highway somewhere in western Illinois. Miles hadn't seen any other cars, just us and the blue sedan. When I saw it turn off ahead, a dirt road leading into a field, I made a sharp turn without signaling, kicking up dust as we bumped down the uneven track. Its headlights were burning in our rearview mirror, and we needed to confront them. I said, "My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and this has gone on long enough." Mia looked at me, her face pale in the dashboard lights. "Are you sure that's safe?" I wasn't sure of anything anymore, but I knew we couldn't keep running. We have no other option. After a quarter of a mile, I pulled over and turned off the engine. The blue sedan pulled up behind us, its headlights shining brightly. I was so relieved that I told myself to stay in the car, my heart thumping so hard that I could hardly hear myself. I said, "If anything happens, drive away as fast as you can." Before she could object, I was out of the car, squinting into the headlights. "Who are you?" I yelled. "Why are you following us?" Nothing happened for a while, and then slowly the blue sedan's driver's door opened, revealing a figure. When the figure stepped forward, I felt my legs go weak. It was a face I hadn't seen in 5 years, a face I never expected to see again. "Dad," I whispered. The man who abandoned my mother and me when I was 17 stood before me, older and grayer, but unmistakably my father. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice shaking with a mixture of emotions I couldn't even begin to untangle why. I stepped out back, lit by the headlight so I couldn't make out any features. Alex called out. He took another step forward, his hands up as if to indicate that he meant no harm. "I saw you in Ohio, and at first I couldn't believe it. I've been trying to get the courage to talk to you, but I heard Mia's door open behind me." "Alex, what's going on?" My father's eyes flickered to her, then back to me. I nodded, still too shocked to form words. "I'm sorry," he said, and I could hear the tears in his voice. "I'm so sorry for everything." Where had he been all these years? Why now? And how did he expect to make up for his absence with a creepy highway stalking routine? But when he finally said, "You scared the hell out of us?" he laughed a sad, broken sound. I know I didn't mean to, but every time I worked up the courage, I would lose it at the last second. Mia then came to stand next to me, her hand slipping into mine. "Perhaps we should all talk," she said softly. "There's a diner about 10 miles back. We could get some coffee and sort this out." As we drove to the diner, following the blue sedan, Mia squeezed my hand and asked, "Are you okay?" I shook my head. As I looked at her, I turned back to my father. Part of me wanted to get back in the car and drive away, leaving him standing there in the dust like he'd left us all those years ago. But another part of me wanted answers. "Okay," I said, "at last, but we're taking separate cars, and if you try anything funny, we're going to understand." He nodded. "Of course, whatever you want, Alex." When we started this road trip, we talked about leaving our baggage behind and starting over. Of course, she was right. I never imagined that baggage would come find us on the highway. As we pulled into the diner parking lot, I took a deep breath, unsure of what to think. "I don't know what to feel." She leaned over and kissed my cheek. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Mia was right, we would face whatever came next. I got out of the car prepared to confront the man who had followed us across 3 states. The man who had once been my father. Ready to hear his story and perhaps even begin writing a new chapter in our relationship. I wasn't sure if I could forgive my father or even if I wanted to try. But I did know that this road trip had taken an unexpected turn that had led us not just across the country but into the complicated web of my past. I realized that sometimes the most significant journeys aren't about the destinations we plan, but rather the unexpected detours that force us to face the things we've been avoiding all along. The last time I saw Eliza Thompson, she was laughing, and the image of her head thrown back, long dark hair catching the golden light of the sunset, while the sound of her joy was carried away by the sea breeze, was something I didn't know at the time. I'm getting ahead of myself, but let me start at the beginning. My name is Michael Chun, and I was a security officer aboard the Emerald Princess, a luxury cruise ship traveling through the Caribbean. It was my 3rd year on the job, and I thought I'd seen it all: drunken fights, petty theft, the odd medical emergency. But in less than 12 hours, she would disappear without a trace, leaving behind nothing but questions and a growing sense of dread that threatened to swallow us all. The disappearance of Eliza was something else entirely. My shift at sea started at 6 a.m., just like every other day. As I made my way through the ship's public areas, I noticed that most of the passengers were still asleep in their cabins. As I passed the grand atrium, I nodded to Eliza, who was wrapping up her night shift at the reception desk. "Good morning, Michael," she said, suppressing a yawn. "Anything exciting planned for today?" I shrugged as usual. "You should get some rest. You look exhausted," she said. As she gathered her belongings, I said, "Oh, I will. But first I'm going to watch the sunrise from my favorite spot on the upper deck." She said, "I love this. No matter how many cruises I work, this never gets old." I looked at her out of the corner of my eye and was struck by how serene she looked. I hesitated because I was on duty, but it was a quiet morning, so why not? I could use some fresh air. We headed to a secluded spot on deck 16, leaning against the railing as the sky gradually lightened. We had gotten to know each other over the past few months through meals in the crew mess and stories we shared in our free time. But then I realized there was still a lot about her that I didn't know. I asked her how long she had been working on cruise ships, and she opened her eyes with a longing smile on her lips. It had been 5 years, but I fell in love with it. The travel, the people, the sense of adventure. I nodded, fully understanding that this was the reason I had continued with this job we continued to talk despite the long hours and time away from home as the sun began to paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Eventually, Eliza yawned again, saying, "Thanks for the company, Michael. See you later." I nodded as she left, realizing that this was the last time I would see her alive. The remainder of my shift went smoothly, but it wasn't until that evening during the nightly staff meeting that I realized something was amiss. "Has anyone seen Eliza?" our supervisor Rita asked, frowning at her clipboard. "Can you go check on her and make sure she's okay?" I nodded as I made my way to the crew quarters. I knocked on Eliza's door, calling her name, but she didn't answer, so I used my master key to get in. It wasn't like Eliza to be late, let alone miss a shift entirely. I saw her this morning, and I offered that she was going to her cabin to sleep after the night shift. But Rita's frown deepened. Half expecting to find her asleep, the cabin was empty. The bed was made to look as though it hadn't been made. Eliza's evening shift uniform was neatly laid out on a chair, and her phone was on the nightstand with its screen dark. I radioed Rita, but she wasn't there, and the cabin appeared to be undisturbed since this morning. There was a lengthy pause before Rita responded, starting the search procedure. The next few hours were a flurry of activity as we combed every inch of the ship, from the engine room to the uppermost decks, and we reviewed security. Eliza was last seen on the security camera outside her cabin at 7:12 a.m., but there was no evidence of her in the footage that interviewed passengers and personnel. As the night went on and our search produced nothing, the atmosphere on the ship grew tense as passengers noticed the increased security presence and started whispering among themselves. The footage showed her entering her room and closing the door behind her, but there was no further footage of her leaving or any indication that she had disappeared into thin air. By morning, we had to confront the reality that we had a missing person. The captain announced that he was looking for any information regarding Eliza's work whereabouts, and her picture was shown on screens all over the ship. We called the closest port authorities and the cruise line's head office, and a Coast Guard search was started. Although we all knew that there was little chance of finding someone in the vast Caribbean, I couldn't help but feel that I was somehow to blame if I had just escorted her to as the investigation progressed. I found myself telling a stern-faced detective from the ship's security team every detail of my last encounter with Eliza. Did she seem nervous or distracted? Did she mention any plans for the day? He asked, and I shook my head no. She seemed happy and relaxed, looking forward to getting some sleep. The detective's eyes narrowed. And you're sure she went into her cabin? Yes, I said for what felt like the longest time. The corridor outside the crew cabins is monitored around the clock, so I hesitated before saying it. But as I did, a chill went down my spine because if it wasn't possible, how had it happened? Days went by, and the mystery only grew deeper. Eliza's cabin was thoroughly searched, and nothing unusual was found, including her passport, wallet, and all of her personal belongings. He nodded, noting in his file that there's no way she could have left without being seen on camera. Believed that she had somehow fallen overboard, though it was unclear how she could have done so without anyone noticing. Others whispered about suicide, but those who knew Eliza rejected this outright because she had been happy and showed no signs of depression or distress. The most unsettling theory that kept me up at night was that someone on the ship was to blame for her disappearance. As there were no signs of a struggle or evidence of foul play, Eliza's family flew in their faces, filled with worry and grief. As I watched from a distance as the investigators briefed them on the possibility that our passengers or crew members could be killers walking among us. As the days stretched into weeks, the investigation hit dead end after dead end. The ship finished its scheduled cruise and returned to port, where more intensive forensic work could be done. But despite the full resources of law enforcement being brought to bear, no new leads emerged. Mother broke down in tears as the situation became real. I wanted to go up to them and offer some consolation, but what could I say? Ultimately, the Emerald Princess set sail once more, with a new crew member replacing Eliza at the reception desk. Life on board resumed as usual, or at least as it seemed. But for those of us who knew her and had looked for her and were left with nothing but questions, things would never be the same. I stayed with the cruise line because I couldn't leave while Eliza's fate came to pass. In the quiet hours of the night, I find myself on deck 16 staring out at the endless expanse of the sea. I think about Eliza and how she used to laugh about how much she loved watching the sunrise. I wonder where she is and if she's still out there somewhere. Every new port brought a glimmer of hope that some clue would surface that someone somewhere might have seen something. However, as months went by without any new information, that hope started to fade. I can't help but feel that the ocean knows the truth, holding its secrets in its incomprehensible depths. For me, the mystery surrounding Eliza Thompson's disappearance is a ghost story that cruise ship crews whisper among themselves. It serves as a constant reminder of how easily a life can disappear without a trace. And every time I watch a security camera feed or see a passenger enter their cabin, I can't help but wonder, could it happen again in this floating city of steel and glass surrounded by the vast, uncaring sea? Are any of us really safe? The Emerald Princess sails on, carrying its cargo of I traced my finger along the edge of the tent canvas, feeling the frayed nylon threads. Whatever had caused this wasn't just sharp, it was wickedly so, and as the fading daylight filtered through that precise cut, casting long shadows across the abandoned campsite, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that we'd stumbled into something far more sinister than a bare canvas. Vacationers and secrets, and somewhere out there, maybe Eliza is still laughing, and her voice is carried away by the endless ocean breeze. Attack! My name is Alex, and I have been hiking the Appalachian Trail with my best friend Jam for the past month. We are seasoned backpackers who are accustomed to the difficulties of long-distance trekking, but nothing from our years of outdoor adventures could have prepared us for what we discovered in that remote clearing deep in the Georgia wilderness. The day had begun like any other on the trail. We had set up camp at dawn in the hopes of covering at least 15 miles before nightfall. The weather was ideal, cool and crisp with just the right amount of wind. We'd made good time, stopping only for a quick lunch and the occasional water break. But it was late afternoon when Jamie noticed the first indication that something was wrong. "Hey Alex," he called, pointing to a tree off the trail. "Check this out." I walked over and squinted at the trunk, where a crude symbol, a circle with a jagged line through it, was carved deep into the bark. The cuts looked fresh, and the exposed wood was still oozing sap. I muttered, "I've never seen a trail marker like that before." Jamie shrugged, "Probably just some we continued despite the child playing." But I couldn't get rid of a growing feeling of unease. The forest seemed quieter than usual, with the typical chorus of bird song and insect buzzing strangely muted. I thought I saw movement in my peripheral vision, but it was always just out of sight. As the sun started to set, we started looking for a suitable campsite, and when we did, we discovered the clearing. A small, level area tucked between two rocky outcroppings with a gurgling stream nearby. As we got closer, we realized we weren't the first to find this idyllic location. The remnants of a campsite were lying in front of us, seemingly as though its occupants had left in the middle of their stay. A tent stood in the middle, its door open and swaying gently in the breeze, and a small cooking pot sat on a makeshift fire pit. The ashes were scattered all over the place, and Jamie and I looked at each other, realizing that even the messiest campers usually packed up before moving. As we cautiously approached, I noticed the first slash in the tent, followed by another and another. The entire structure was covered in them, each one precise and deliberate. What the hell was I breathing? I peered inside the ruined shelter, which was a mess, with sleeping bags and shredded clothes scattered everywhere and a flashlight lying on its side, its beam creating eerie shadows. "Hello, Jamie," he called out to anyone here. It illuminated a small notebook, which I picked up and flipped open to the last entry. The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic, and as I turned to leave, I noticed something half hidden beneath it. The others think I'm crazy, but I know what I saw. It's not a bear. It's not anything natural, and God help us if it gets in. I showed Jamie the notebook and he said, "We should go," with his voice barely above a whisper now. My hands were shaking as I picked up a camera from a torn sleeping bag, praying that the battery wasn't dead. The screen flickered to life, revealing the last image taken, and my heart almost stopped. The picture was dark, obviously taken at night, but there was something at the edge of the frame that was illuminated by the flash. A shape that was almost human but not quite, long spindly limbs, a face that was more shadow than substance, and eyes that reflected the camera's flash like a cat's, but much larger. I dropped the camera, stumbling. I nodded and grabbed my own backpack, but as I turned to go, I noticed with horror that the sun had almost set, and that the forest around us was turning into a twilight shadow that was growing longer and merging into an impenetrable gloom. Jimia was already gathering his pack, and he said in a tense voice, "We'll hike through the night if we have to." A small silver locket was half buried in the soft earth near the fire pit. The trees seemed to press in closer, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. And more than once I thought I heard something moving in the underbrush, always just out of sight. Do you remember that strange symbol we saw earlier? Jamie panting as we pushed through a particularly dense thicket? I think I saw another one, carved into a massive oak. Without thinking, I scooped it up and shoved it in my pocket. We set off at a brisk pace, trying to retrace our steps in the remaining light, but nothing looked familiar. We saw the same circle and line symbol before, but this one appeared older. The carving's edges were worn, and moss had grown. I said, not believing what I was saying, "Come on, we need to keep moving." But as we continued, more symbols appeared, some of which were new and some of which were old, and they seemed to be leading us to something I couldn't say. The darkness was almost complete, and now our headlamps were creating little islands of light in a sea of blackness. The forest was quiet except for when we heard the crunch of our boots on fallen leaves and the increasingly ragged sound of our breathing. We heard a low, guttural sound that sounded like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere. Jemia froze, and I shook my head, unable to speak. My instinct told me to run, but I knew that panicking now would only make us more lost. So we pushed on, moving as quietly as we could, but the sounds kept getting closer. Branches snapped behind us, something rustled in the canopy overhead, and then just ahead, I saw a flicker of movement as a tall, impossible-to-thin shape slipped between two trees. In the brief flash of my headlamp, I saw pale, elongated legs and a face that was little more than a dark void with pinpricks of reflected light where eyes should be. I yelled, forgetting all thoughts of stealth, and we crashed through the undergrowth, blind panic driving us forward. Branches whipped at our faces, and roots threatened to trip us at every step. I'm not sure how long we ran. It might have been minutes or hours, but then, miraculously, we exploded out onto a wide gravel road. A park ranger station was standing just ahead of its windows, glowing with welcoming light, and we staggered towards it, gasping for air. As we reached the door, I had the opportunity to glance back at the forest from which we had just fled. At the edge of the trees stood a figure that was tall and incredibly thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. It raised a hand that was more claw than human, and for a little while I thought it would follow us into the light. But then it turned and melted back into the forest shadows in a matter of seconds, leaving no trace of its presence. The rangers were dubious of our accounts, naturally attributing our experience to fatigue, dehydration, and an overactive imagination. Nevertheless, they sent out a search party to look into the abandoned campsite, but they discovered nothing. Not even a sign of a campfire, no tent, and no scattered equipment. It seemed as though the entire scene had disappeared into thin air in the days that followed Jamie, and I never reported finding the locket because I knew that doing so would only lead to more questions that I wasn't sure I wanted answered. Jemia and I never completed our hike because of an unspoken agreement that we packed up and went home after our adventure on the Appalachian Trail cut. I thought about that silver locket I'd pocketed in my panic a lot. When I finally worked up the courage to open it, I discovered a small photo inside of a smiling family. Mother, father, and two children, posed in front of a familiar-looking clearing. In summary, we don't discuss what happened in those woods very often, but occasionally on dark nights when the wind whispers through the trees, I find myself thinking about that abandoned campsite and what we saw there. I wonder with a bone-deep chill if somewhere in the deepest, darkest parts of the wilderness, it's thinking about us too. The scream that ripped through the cab of my truck that night wasn't human. No one could have made a sound like that, raw, primal, and the man sitting next to me, the hitchhiker, was the source of the fear that chilled my blood. I had picked him up an hour earlier, and as his eyes flew open, reflecting the dashboard lights like some untamed animals, I knew with grim certainty that whatever had just transpired or whatever he had seen in his dreams was far from over. My name is Jack, and I have been driving big rigs across the country for almost 20 years. I have seen my fair share of strange things out on the desolate highways like ghost lights. The radio kept me company with a mix of old country tunes and late-night talk shows about conspiracy theories and alien abductions. It had started as a routine haul Phoenix to Seattle with a trailer full of electronics, and I was enjoying the miles melting away under my wheels as I cruised through the desert night. Inexplicable weather, even the occasional UFO if you catch me after a few beers, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened on that moonless night in the middle of nowhere, Nevada. I'm not usually one to pick up hitchhikers because there are too many scary stories and risks involved, but something about this guy made me slow down. Perhaps it was the way he hugged himself against the chill desert wind or the lost look in his eyes, but before I knew it, I was pulling over where you were going. I called out as he approached anywhere, but he replied in a voice that was hardly audible above a whisper. I should have driven off at that point, but he climbed into the passenger seat and brought with him the smell of dust and something else I couldn't quite place up close. He looked young, maybe in his mid-20s, with shaggy brown hair and eyes that seemed to dart nervously around the cab. "I'm Jack," I said, pulling back onto the highway. "Mike." He didn't meet my gaze, but thanks for the ride. For a while, we drove in silence, the only sounds being the rumble of the engine and the whisper of tires on asphalt. To strike up a conversation a few times, but Mike's answers were at best monosyllabic, so I finally stopped paying attention to the road ahead. About an hour later, I noticed that Mike had fallen asleep, leaning his head against the window. I turned down the radio a bit so as not to wake him, and that's when things started to get strange. It started with a slight movement of his hand, then his breathing became shallow and fast, and his eyes began moving frantically behind closed lids, as if he were in the depths of I was about to wake him up from a very intense dream because I was afraid he might be having a fit when he began muttering. At first, it was too low to hear, but it soon became louder. His voice was full of pure, unadulterated fear. "Hey buddy," I said, reaching out to shake his shoulder. "Wake up, you're having a nightmare." But he didn't wake up. Instead, his muttering became more frantic, and his body began to thrash in the seat. "Oh God, it's coming," I thought. Its eyes are hidden from view, and that's when it let out the scream that almost caused me to drive off the road. His eyes flew open, wild and unfocused, reflecting the green glow of the dashboard like some nocturnal animal. I was able to stop, and my heart was thumping in my chest. Mike snapped out of it, turning to face me, but his eyes seemed to be seeing something else. He whispered, "Oh God, Jack," and it followed me into the truck, leaving me with goosebumps. Before I could stop him, he had thrown open the passenger door and leaped out into the night. I cursed and fumbled with my seatbelt before following him. The desert night was cold and still, and the only sounds were Mike's ragged breathing and the tick of the cooling engine. He stood a few feet from the truck arms, WRA wrapped around himself. "There's nothing here but us," Mike said, shaking his head violently. "You can't see it, but it's always here," I said to Mike, shaking like a leaf, and I approached him slowly like you would a scared animal. "What's going on?" he asked, turning to face me, his face pale in the truck's headlights. I don't know what it is, but it's been after me for days ever since I found that thing in the desert. I asked, feeling sick to my stomach. Mike reached into his pocket with a trembling hand and took out what appeared to be a small stone, but as he held it up, I realized it wasn't a stone at all, but rather an artifact. I found this out there, Mike said, gesturing vaguely at the dark desert surrounding us in some sort of ancient ruin. I thought it might be worth something, but he laughed bitterly. I didn't know it would wake it up. I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer, and Mike's eyes met mine with a terror that made my blood run cold. It was carved with intricate symbols I'd never seen before, and in the harsh glare of the headlights, it seemed to shimmer and shift as if the symbols were moving. I wanted to tell him that he was insane because he had just had a nightmare in which there was no monster hunting him, but the conviction in his voice and the unadulterated fear in his eyes made it impossible to ignore this. Okay, I said, trying to sound calm, so why don't we just give it back, throw that thing away, and be done with it? Mike frantically shook his head. I've tried, but it doesn't work like that. He nodded and said, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, I didn't want to, but I can't take it anymore. The dreams and visions were driving me crazy, so I took a step back and realized how alone we were out here in the desert night, Mike. I won't take it. It's like it's attached to me now, and the only way to get rid of it is to pass it on to someone else to make them take it. The artifact seemed to call to me, the symbols swirling in a mesmerizing dance, but I shook my head and snapped out of it. I said firmly, I won't do it, Mike, but I'll help you figure this out together. Okay, there's got to be a way to get rid of that thing without passing it on. Mike stared at me for a long time, his expression unreadable, and then slowly he nodded okay. He whispered okay, well, I'm not sure what happened to Mike, but after I dropped him off in Reno, he said he was going to find an expert who could help him get rid of the artifact. We tried getting back in the truck, and the artifact was safely wrapped in a cloth and stowed in the glove compartment. As we pulled back onto the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The night seemed darker, the shadows deeper, and more than once I thought I saw something moving just at the edge of my headlights. I gave him my number and made him promise to call and let me know he was okay, but it's been 3 months since I last heard from him. Sometimes when I'm driving through the desert late at night, I find myself looking at the side of the road, half expecting to see him standing there with his thumb out, and other times, when I'm trying to fall asleep, I see tall, twisted shapes with too many eyes in the shadows of my room. I tell myself that it's just my imagination, the lingering effects of that strange night, but I know the truth regardless. The leather-bound journal fell open in my hands, its yellowed pages releasing a musty cloud of dust and decay. At first, I thought it was just another relic of the farm's long history, perhaps a record of crop yields or livestock lineages, but as my eyes skimmed a faded, spidery handwriting, my heart started racing. I was hunting Mike that night, and whatever lived in his dreams is still out there, waiting and watching. Sometimes when the night is at its darkest, I can't get rid of the feeling that it's watching me too. There was no typical farm ledger, the words human subject and genetic manipulation jumped out at me, and I realized with increasing horror that I had discovered something much darker than I could have ever imagined. Little did I know that this discovery would force me to reevaluate everything I believed to be true about the peaceful rural world around me. My name is Sam, and I had only been working at Willow Creek Farm for about a month when I discovered the journal. I had just graduated from college with a degree in agriculture, and I had dreams of when I had the opportunity to work as a farmhand for old Mr. Harrison. When I eventually owned my own farm, I jumped at the chance. The pay wasn't great, but the experience was priceless, and there was something charming about the expansive, slightly dilapidated property with its weathered barns and endless fields. Mr. Harrison was a quiet, gruff, but fair man who lived alone in the large farmhouse with his wife long dead and his kids moved to the city. He didn't talk much about the history of the farm. He simply gave me my daily tasks and left me to take care of the farm. It was a hot, muggy afternoon in late July when Mr. Harrison asked me to clear out one of the old barns. He had been putting it off for years, so he said, might as well put you to use on it. He said, pile up anything that looks worth keeping and haul the rest to the burn pile. The barn was a cavernous structure, its interior dim and cool compared to the sweltering heat outside. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that streamed through gaps in the weathered boards. The air was heavy as the dust. I began in one corner, sorting through piles of rusted farm equipment, moldering sacks of feed, and broken furniture, surrounded by the smell of old hay and something else chemical that I couldn't quite place. It was tedious work, and as I carried item after item to the expanding pile outside, I noticed the loose floorboard. I might have missed it completely if my boot hadn't caught on the edge, almost sending me sprawling. Curious, I bent down to look at it, and as I lifted it, I saw the journal was wrapped in oilcloth and was surprisingly well preserved considering its hiding place. I pulled it out, looking guiltily over my shoulder even though I knew Mr. Harrison was off in the fields. It felt intrusive to read someone else's private thoughts, but my curiosity quickly turned to confusion and then to horror when I realized that the journal belonged to a Dr. Elliot Harrison, dated 1954, Mr. Harrison's father. This was no typical farmer. The pages described intricate scientific experiments that went far beyond what I had learned in my agriculture classes. Dr. Harrison wrote about his efforts to use genetic manipulation to produce more resilient and productive livestock, but he wasn't just experimenting on animals. There were also detailed notes about human subjects and hazy references to volunteers from the nearby asylum. As I turned the pages, my hands trembled as I read about failed experiments of creatures that weren't completely. The final entry, dated 1963, was different. The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic. The experiment was successful. But at what cost? They're out there now, hiding in the woods and in the fields, and I can hear them at night scratching at the walls. Human nor fully animal sketches that made me sick, and throughout it all, there was a growing sense of the doctor's obsession and his conviction that he was on the verge of a breakthrough that would revolutionize agriculture and change the world. I tried to rationalize it, but even as I did, memories of strange things that had happened around the farm started to surface. The strange noises I had heard at night were dismissed as wildlife, and the areas of the property that Mr. Harrison had warned me to avoid were the way the cattle sometimes seemed spooked by something I couldn't see. I shoved the journal back into its hiding place, my mind reeling that I needed to leave this place. I stepped outside to get some fresh air and clear my head, blinking in the harsh sunlight. I almost ran into Mr. Harrison, who asked me about my progress while glancing at the pile of junk I had accumulated. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and he asked if he knew about the journal, about what his father had done. Mr. Harrison's eyes narrowed slightly as if he could sense my uneasiness. "Everything is fine, Sam. You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine," I managed to say, "just it's hot in there." "Don't work too hard, come on." I watched him leave, trying to make sense of the stern old man I knew and the dark past I had just discovered. Was he carrying on his father's work, or was he as much a victim of it as anyone else? That night, as I lay in bed in the tiny apartment above the garage that Mr. Harrison had given me, I was unable to fall asleep because every rustle from the fields outside and every creak of the old building made me anxious. I kept thinking about the journal, about the creatures, Dr. Harrison's creatures. Had written about whether they were still out there after all these years, but a sudden noise outside my window made me jump up. It was a strange, guttural sound that I had never heard before, and it made my heart race. I scampered to the window and looked out into the darkness, but at first I saw nothing. Then I noticed something moving in the field beyond the barn. It was big and most definitely not a cow, and its movements were jerky and unnatural. Then it turned and I caught a glimpse of its face in the moonlight. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my bed, every muscle tense, listening to the sounds of movement outside. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted but relieved that, in the light of day, everything would make sense again. However, as the days went by, strange things started to happen more frequently. Tools would disappear only to reappear in strange places, and the cattle grew increasingly wild. I bit back a scream as I came back from the window. Agitated, especially at night, and I saw Mr. Harrison looking troubledly off into the woods on multiple occasions. I considered packing up and leaving Willow Creek Farm as soon as possible, but something stopped me, perhaps curiosity or a sense of duty, because whatever Dr. Harrison had done or created was still out there, and perhaps there was something I could do about it. I started my own research carefully at first, going over the journal again and taking notes. I investigated the far reaches of the property areas. Mr. Harrison had instructed me to avoid searching for signs of the creatures in order to comprehend the science behind Dr. Harrison's experiments. Gradually, I began to piece together the truth that the experiments had continued after his last journal entry, which was passed down from father to son. Mr. Harrison wasn't just aware of what his father had done, he was also working to fix it. It all came to a head one stormy night in late August when I was awakened by the sound of breaking glass and Mr. Harrison's cries. I hurried to the farmhouse where the front door was splintered and hanging off its hinges. Inside, the scene was chaotic, with furniture overturned, claw marks scoring the walls, and Mr. Harrison standing in the middle of the living room facing a creature that defied description, part human, part animal, with eyes that glowed with an unnatural intelligence. Mr. Harrison yelled when he saw the syringe on the mantel. In the days that followed, Mr. Harrison sank to his knees, his face a mask of relief and exhaustion, and, without thinking, I grabbed a glowing blue liquid and tossed it to him. In one fluid motion, he caught it and plunged it into the creature's neck. The creature let out a howl that made my blood run cold, thrashed wildly for a moment, and then collapsed to the floor, its body appearing to melt and reform before my eyes. I still work on the farm with Mr. Harrison, and he told me all about how his father's experiments had produced a few hybrid creatures that had been hiding in the woods for decades and occasionally coming out to terrorize the farm. Harrison also told me that he had spent his entire life trying to find a cure or a way to undo what his father had done. The man we captured that night was the last of them. With him cured, the long nightmare was finally over, but the weight of it would always be with me. The secrets of Willow Creek Farm are now buried as they should be, but the lessons about responsibility and the unintended consequences of our actions will always be with me. Sometimes on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the cornfields, I find myself looking at the tree line and wondering if we really found them all. I can't help but think about the thin line between scientific advancement and playing God, and how easy it is to cross that line with the best of intentions. The footprints ended abruptly in the middle of the field, as if their owner had simply disappeared into thin air. I stood there with my flashlight in hand, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, because, in my 20 years on the force, I had never seen anything like this. The car was still running, the keys were in the ignition, and the driver's personal belongings were unharmed. It seemed as though the driver had stepped out for a moment and simply vanished without warning. My name is Sarah Jennings, and I have been a state trooper in Nevada for 20 years. I thought I had seen it all: high-speed chases, horrific accidents, even the occasional UFO report from some poor soul who had been out in the desert heat for too long. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night on a lonely stretch of Highway 50 deep in what the locals call the Unsolved Mysteries. The seemingly routine call would lead me down a rabbit hole of unexplainable events and unsolved mysteries that would haunt me for years to come. The loneliest road in America began as a routine night shift. I was driving down the highway more distracted by tumbleweed than by traffic when a passing motorist called to report an abandoned car on the side of the road with blinking hazard lights. It was standard procedure for me to check it out, call a tow if needed, and head out. As I pulled up behind the late-model sedan, I noticed something strange. The engine was still running. I approached cautiously, one hand on my holster out of habit. The driver's side door was slightly open, but no one was there. I shone my flashlight inside, and everything appeared to be normal: a phone charging on the dashboard, a duffel bag in the back seat, a half-empty water bottle in the cup holder. No signs of a struggle, no blood, nothing to suggest foul play. Hello. I called out, sweeping my flashlight over the area, and the only person there was the highway patrol. That's when I noticed the footprints. I radioed in my predicament and started to follow the prints. The field was primarily bare scrub brush and hard-packed earth, making it easy to see the trail in the beam of my flashlight. I expected to find the driver relieving themselves behind a bush or perhaps having wandered off in confusion, but instead I found nothing. There was only one set of footprints leading away from the driver's side door into the field next to the highway, and they were clear and purposeful, not the staggering tracks of someone hurt or confused. Yards into the field, and then there was nothing but undisturbed earth stretching into the darkness. I stood there for a long time, my mind refusing to comprehend what I was seeing. People don't just disappear. There must be a reason. I scanned the area thoroughly, expanding my circle to look for any indications of disturbance, but there were none. No scuff marks to show that someone had jumped or been lifted, no signs of a struggle, just those footprints ending in the middle of nowhere. By the time backup arrived, I was sweating in spite of the cool night air. My coworker Mike noticed something strange about my face and asked, "What have we got, Sarah?" His hand automatically went to his holster as I explained the situation, showing him the car and the footprints. The impossible ending. He followed me out into the field, his own confusion growing with every step. "This is weird," he said, finally standing at the end of the trail. We called in forensics, had the area cordoned off, and the following few hours were a flurry of activity, taking pictures. In the days that followed the incident, we were no closer to an explanation when dawn broke, casting long shadows across the field, and we discovered that the driver was a 37-year-old software engineer from San Francisco named David Chin. His family was contacted, but they hadn't heard from him. Yes, he was driving to visit them in Denver, but he had no history of mental illness or erratic behavior. Search parties stepped up their investigation. Helicopters used thermal imaging to scan the area for miles, and David's phone records, bank statements, and internet history were examined. Missing persons bulletins were sent out across several states, but there was no clue as to what had happened to David Chin. Theories abound, each more bizarre than the last, with some speculating that he had been kidnapped by criminals from an alien cult, others that he had staged his own disappearance, and discussions of covert government experiments. Portals to other dimensions. I made an effort to remain grounded and concentrate on the facts, but the more I investigated the case, the more I discovered. A week after David vanished, I received an anonymous tip. The caller, whose trembling voice was covered by some sort of modulator, instructed me to investigate something called the Highway of Tears. At first, I thought it was just another crackpot lead, but something about the caller's urgency kept me awake that night, so I started my research, and what I discovered chilled me to the bone. It wasn't just one highway, it was a phenomenon that was reported in several states and even several countries. In some cases, witnesses reported seeing strange lights in the sky, while in others they described a sense of time passing and the world around them appearing to change and shift. The more cases I looked into, the more I discovered that mirrored David's, such as an Alaskan woman whose car was found with her purse still on the seat. Footprints leading into the snow before abruptly stopping, an Australian truck driver who disappeared while making a routine delivery and whose rig was found idling on the outback highway. I started to compile a file, cross-referencing cases in search of patterns. The majority of the disappearances occurred at night, many of them in remote areas, and in a number of cases witnesses reported electronic malfunctions such as radios cutting out and phones losing signal just before the disappearances. As my off-duty hours were consumed by this research, I was able to Mike confronted me about it one night over coffee at the station, Sarah, saying, "You've got to let this go." His eyes were full of concern. "The Chen case is cold, it's eating you up." I wanted to tell him everything about the highway of tears, about the patterns I've discovered, but I knew how it would sound. I felt like I was changing. I became jumpy and paranoid every time I patrolled that stretch of Highway 50. I found myself scanning the horizon, half expecting to see strange lights or shadowy figures. The following night, I found myself back on Highway 50 off-duty with my personal vehicle loaded with cameras and scanning equipment I'd borrowed from a friend in the UFO watching community. I'm not sure what I expected to find, perhaps proof to make sense of the inexplicable, but instead I got something completely different. It was just after midnight when my radio began to crackle with static. I nodded, promising to take some time off to clear my head, but I couldn't let it go. I initially assumed it was just sporadic reception out here, but then I noticed that my dashboard lights were flickering, my headlights were dimming and then brightening and then dimming again, and my heart was racing. I pulled over to the side of the road, thinking that this was the electronic interference that had been reported in other cases. I grabbed my camera, prepared to record whatever happened next, when I noticed a light in the field next to the highway. It wasn't a flashlight or a car headlight, but something else, and it pulsed with a gentle bluish glow that hovered. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice was yelling at me to stop, get back in the car, and drive away as quickly as possible, but it was drowned out by an overwhelming sense of curiosity and longing. I had to know what the light was. I had to understand. I don't know how long I walked, but time seemed to lose all meaning as the light stayed just ahead of me, always just out of reach I was vaguely aware of. I stepped out of my car about 6 feet off the ground, camera forgotten in my hand. I blinked, confused, the spell broken, and found myself standing in the middle of the field, not knowing how far I'd come. I turned back toward the highway, expecting to see my car's headlights, but instead I saw nothing, just an empty desert that stretched out in all directions, silvered by the light of a moon I didn't remember seeing earlier. Panic struck, and as I spun around to regain my bearings, I noticed footprints in the dirt. Footprints that led to where I was, and beyond them, another set of familiar prints that I had seen once before. Everything ended suddenly in the middle of nowhere. I stood there, my head spinning, realizing that I was no longer the investigator and had become a part of the mystery. As the first rays of dawn started to appear on the horizon, I decided to follow those footprints of David Chin, regardless of what had happened to him or what lay beyond that. Something out there in the vast emptiness of the Nevada desert is an abandoned car with its engine still running and a set of footprints leading nowhere. The highway of tears had claimed another victim, and I had become just another unsolved mystery on the loneliest road in America. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for whatever came next, and then I stepped forward, leaving my own trail of footprints in the desert sand. I stared at it, my coffee mug left in my hand as the rising sun cast long shadows over our devastated campsite. Our food was scattered across tents that had been slashed, and there was an eerie silence where bird songs should have been. However, it was that one enormous footprint that sent a shiver down my spine. Whatever had visited us during the night was no normal animal, and I had a sickening feeling that it wasn't done with us yet. My name is Alex, and this camping trip my wife, Sarah, our 2 children, Lily and Max, and I had spent months organizing this trip to Blue Pine Campground, a secluded location tucked away deep in the mountains. We arrived late yesterday afternoon, the kids buzzing with excitement as we set up our tents and gathered wood for the fire. As the sun set, we roasted marshmallows and told ghost stories, our laughter echoing through the trees. It was supposed to be an opportunity for my family to reconnect, escape the constant buzz of technology, and remember what it was like to just be together. When I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of rustling outside our tent, far too loud to be a raccoon or any of the small wildlife we'd been warned about, I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent flap, and peered out the beam of light, catching a flash of movement at the edge of our campsite. Something large ducked behind a tree too. We'd finally found a way to stop the hectic pace of our lives and just breathe. If only I had realized at that time how quickly our idyllic retreat would turn into a nightmare. Alex, what's going on? Sarah's voice jolted me out of my reverie as she stood in the entrance of our tent, her eyes widening as she took in the scene. I zipped the tent back up and lay awake for hours listening to the sounds of something large moving around our camp. When morning arrived, the full extent of the intrusion became clear. Our cooler had been upended, its contents scattered across the ground, claw marks scored the sides of our tents, and there in a patch of bare earth was that enormous footprint. As Sarah woke the kids and we started cleaning up the mess, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that we were being watched. The forest around us seemed too quiet, the shadows between the trees too deep. Dad, can we go home? Lily asked in a small, scared voice, clutching her stuffed rabbit, and I wanted nothing more than to say yes to packing up. I tried to keep my voice calm for her sake. It looks like we had a visitor last night, probably a bear, but even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. Our belongings and drive back to the safety of civilization, but when I tried to start the car, my blood ran cold, the engine sputtered and died, refusing to turn over no matter how many times I tried. I told my family, trying to look confident, that it was okay, that I didn't feel anything, probably just a dead battery, and that I would hike down to the ranger station and get help. Sarah grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with fear. You can't go out there alone. What if? Sarah was right, of course, but what options did we have? In the end, we made the decision to stay together, so we packed some supplies and headed down the trail towards the ranger station. It was only 5 miles, which would have been an easy hike under normal circumstances, but every time a twig snapped or a bush rustled and we were about halfway there, Max noticed another footprint pressing into a patch of mud next to the trail. This one was even bigger and fresher than the first, and it was following us. Sarah whispered, drawing the children close, and I wanted to reassure her that it was the words stuck in my throat, probably just by coincidence, but I knew deep down that she was right. We picked up our pace, the kids whimpering as branches scratched at their arms and legs. The sun was setting, the forest was getting darker by the minute, and the ranger station still didn't seem to be any closer. Then we heard a low rumbling growl that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. At that moment, Lily screamed and Max started crying. I yelled, scooping Lily, and Sarah grabbed Max's hand. We drove blindly in panic. Branches whipped at our faces, roots threatened to trip us at every step, and as that growl got closer, I had the opportunity to look back and instantly wished I hadn't, because something huge and dark was moving through the trees behind us. I saw a flash of teeth and glowing eyes before I turned around and ran faster than I had ever run in my life. We suddenly burst into a small clearing, gasping for air, and miraculously, there was a cabin instead of the ranger station we had been aiming for. Like salvation, I didn't pause to consider our luck as we hurried to the door in the hopes that it would be unlocked. The handle twisted under my hands, and we fell inside, slamming the door behind us. For a long time, we just stood there, heaving, listening to the sounds of something big circling the cabin. We heard scratching noises coming from the walls and a low, frustrated growl. "What is it, Daddy?" Lily whimpered, burying her face in my shoulder. "I don't know, sweetheart," I said, caressing her hair. As our eyes adapted to the gloom, we started to observe our surroundings. The cabin was small, with only one room, a fireplace, a few rustic pieces of furniture, and shelves stocked with supplies and canned goods. It appeared to be some sort of hunting cabin or emergency shelter. Sarah found some lanterns and lit them, creating a warm glow throughout the room while the children huddled on a threadbare couch. She pulled me aside, asking, "Alex, what are we going to do?" in a trembling voice. "What if it doesn't leave?" I took a deep breath, trying to think logically. We have a place to stay, and there appears to be enough food here to last for a while, so we'll wait it out. However, as the night went on, that confidence started to falter. The creature outside showed no signs of leaving, and we could hear it moving around the cabin, testing the walls and door. Every now and then it would roar, causing the windows to rattle. The children eventually fell into an uncomfortable sleep, exhausted from the day's terror. Sarah and I alternated watching through the windows. I saw it clearly for the first time during my watch in the darkest hours of the night. The moon had emerged from behind the clouds, lighting up the clearing in front of the cabin, and there stood a creature that shouldn't have been there. It was enormous, easily 8 feet tall, with a body that appeared to be a patchwork of animal parts. Thick fur covered most of its body, but I could see patches of scales and what appeared to be feathers. Its face was a terrifying combination of a bear and something nearly human. As I watched frozen in horror, its eyes glowed an unnatural yellow in the moonlight. It turned those glowing eyes directly towards me, and then it smiled impossibly, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. I staggered back from the window, my heart thumping so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I'm not sure how long we stayed in that cabin, but the growl that rumbled through the night was very real. The days were blurred together, marked only by the rising, and with the sun setting and the creature outside constantly present, we carefully rationed our food, knowing that we might have to wait a long time. The kids were surprisingly resilient, making our confinement into a game of sorts, but I could see the strain wearing on Sarah. On what I believe was the 5th day, we woke up to silence, with no growls or cautious scratching at the walls. I looked out the window and the clearing was empty. We waited another full day before we dared to leave the forest, and it appeared normal. We returned to our campsite half expecting to find it destroyed, but instead we found park rangers in a search party and our car had been fixed. Apparently someone had noticed it sitting abandoned and called it in, so we told them a sanitized version of events, that we'd gotten lost, found the cabin, and waited out a storm, but who would believe the truth? Once more, there were birds singing, small animals scuttling around, and claw marks on the cabin walls. We never went camping again, but occasionally on dark nights when the wind howls outside our securely locked doors, I find myself thinking about that cabin in the woods and wondering if somewhere out there in the vast wilderness that creature is still roaming, waiting for the next unwary family to cross its path. As we drove home, the kids were talking excitedly about their adventure, and I couldn't get rid of the feeling that we had seen something we weren't meant to see, a creature that lurked in the shadows of the world, defying explanation. The first thing I noticed was the silence on a cruise ship with over 3,000 passengers and 1,500 crew members. Silence is never a good sign. I stood in the middle of the Leo deck, where just hours before families had been splashing in the pool and music had been blasting from the speakers. Now, all I could hear was the soft lapping of waves against the hull and the distant hum of engines as I turned in a slow circle. The wilderness holds ancient and terrifying secrets, and sometimes those secrets have teeth and claws. My name is Mia Chin, and what should have been a leisurely Caribbean cruise turned into the most confusing and terrifying experience of my life. I'm still not sure I believe what happened to me, but I do know that time isn't as linear as we think it is, and sometimes the fabric of reality can slip in ways we can't begin to understand. As I took in the abandoned lounge chairs and half-empty cocktails, a chill went down my spine. Where was everyone, and why did the air suddenly feel so different? I remembered closing my eyes and the ships gently rocking me to sleep. When I woke up, the light coming in through my porthole window seemed off, dimmer somehow, with a strange bluish quality I'd never seen before. I was disoriented and checked my phone. I had woken up late, nursed a slight hangover from the previous night's karaoke party with a greasy breakfast, and spent the morning relaxing by the pool with my most recent beach read. Around noon, I made the decision to return to my cabin for a quick nap before the afternoon's activities. A knot of uneasiness formed in my stomach as I stepped out into the hallway, which was deserted, with the usual bustle of passengers and crew members conspicuously absent. My footsteps echoed unnaturally loud on the carpeted floor as I made my way towards the elevator. The screen was completely dead, black, and completely dead even though it had been fully charged when I lay down, frowning. I tried the cabin's phone, but all I heard was a faint buzzing on the line. When the elevator doors opened onto the Leo deck, the full extent of the strangeness hit me. I tried to reason that maybe there was some kind of emergency drill that I had slept through, but no, they always announced those well in advance, and surely someone would have woken me. "Bank hello," I called out in my voice, sounding small and lost in the empty corridor, but there was no response. The elevator arrived with a cheerful ding that seemed wildly out of place in the eerie silence. When I finished my circuit of the deck, I noticed something that chilled me to the bone. The lifeboats were all still in place if there had been some sort of emergency. The deck was completely empty, with lounge chairs sitting empty, some with towels and books still draped over them as if their occupants had just stepped away for a moment. The bars were unmanned, rows of colorful cocktails left on their counters. I walked slowly around the deck, my heart pounding hello. I called again, louder this time, but no one answered. As I searched the ship deck by deck over the next few hours, I noticed that the theater was halfway set up for the evening show. The casino slot machines were blinking silently in the dim light. The main dining room table was set for a dinner that would never be served, and everywhere I looked, I found signs of life, including half-eaten buffet items, a load of laundry that kept tumbling endlessly in a dryer in the otherwise empty laundromat, and a child. As night fell, or what I assumed to be night given the deepening of that strange bluish light, I made my way to the bridge in the hopes of finding someone who could explain what was happening. The bridge was as empty as the rest of the ship, but at least here were signs of life. Radar screens blinked, showing our position in the middle of the Caribbean Sea, and navigation systems hummed softly. The ship was still intact. A stuffed animal had fallen in the middle of a hallway, but I found no trace of the thousands of people who should have been on board. As I sat there looking blankly at the array of instruments in front of me, something caught my eye, the date display on one of the monitors. I blinked, sure I must be seeing things, but no, there it was in glowing green letters, August 13th, 2024, a week ago somehow, now impossibly a week ago. Of course, its automated systems were still working even in the absence of human oversight. I finally collapsed into the captain's chair, exhausted and terrified. The next few days, if they were days at all, seemed to pass in a blur as time seemed to have lost all meaning. I wandered the ship, leaving notes in every public place pleading for a response, for some indication that I wasn't alone. Once a week had passed since I'd lain down for my nap. I laughed, and then a high, hysterical sound echoed strangely in the empty bridge. People couldn't just lose a week of time. Entire ships full of people didn't just disappear. On what I believe was the fourth day of my isolation, I saw the lights. At first, I thought I was hallucinating, but then I noticed that there were far-off pinpricks of light on the horizon growing. I ate from the slowly rotting supplies in the ship's massive kitchens, slept fitfully in a different cabin every night, and tried to keep myself sane by talking out loud and recounting my actions as if I were the protagonist in some bizarre reality show. Then, as the lights got closer, I realized with a start that they weren't coming from the sea, but rather from the sky. My elation turned to confusion, then to a kind of numb acceptance. Of course, why shouldn't there be strange lights in the sky after everything else? The lights descended slowly, hovering over the ship, beautifully pulsing with colors. Hope was growing stronger by the minute. Another ship, a rescue party. I ran to the bow, waving my arms and shouting, even though I knew they were still too far away to see or hear me. As I watched a beam of light shoot down from the center of the formation, touching the deck only a few feet away from me, I had no idea what I was doing. Then, as abruptly as they had appeared, the lights disappeared and I was no longer alone. The deck was crowded with passengers wearing sundresses and swimsuits, crew members in their clean uniforms, and passengers milling around in confusion, their voices rising in a flurry of questions and exclamations. What happened? Where did everyone go? Was I dreaming? I stood frozen, unable to realizing what I was seeing. A man in a captain's uniform strode toward me with a worried expression on his face. "Miss, are you okay? You look pale." I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. How could I possibly explain what had happened in the days that followed as the ship returned to port? A story was pieced together by everyone else on board, and no time had passed at all. One moment they had been going about their day, and the next they found themselves standing on the deck, confused and disoriented, and I was the only one who could understand. The incident made headlines all over the world, and I recalled the empty ship, the days of solitude, and the strange lights that only I had experienced during that impossible week. Experts were consulted, theories were put forth, and some people spoke of wormholes, others of alien abduction, and some fringe voices even suggested a mass hallucination or a complex hoax. As for me, I gave my statement to the authorities and then withdrew from the public eye, wondering how I could explain something I didn't understand. I've never been on another cruise ship, but the sight of the ocean fills me with a nameless dread, and sometimes in the dead of night, I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced that I'm back there alone on an empty ship, adrift in a sea of time. I don't know what happened on the paradise of the seas, where everyone went, why I was left behind, or what those lights in the sky were, but I do. I don't know what happened on the paradise of the seas. I don't know where everyone went, why I was abandoned, or what those lights in the sky were, but I do the next time you're on a cruise, or any ship for that matter, and you feel a sudden chill. Notice the quality of the light change ever so slightly, or find yourself alone in a place that is beyond our comprehension. Know that our understanding of the reality of time and space is far more limited than we think. There are forces at work that we can't even begin to comprehend, and sometimes, if we're very unlucky, we catch a glimpse of them. The scratching began on the first night, a faint, persistent sound that might have been tree branches against the cabin's wooden walls if not for the complete stillness of the air outside. I lay awake, listening to Emily's steady breathing next to me, and I prayed with all my heart that you wouldn't fall through the cracks of time like I did. Trust me, once you've experienced that kind of impossible solitude, you're never quite the same again. What was supposed to be a romantic getaway with my girlfriend turned into a waking nightmare that I'm still trying to comprehend. We'd been dating for a year, and with both of us drowning in work stress, a week in a remote cabin seemed like the perfect escape. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just us and the great outdoors. It wasn't until I heard a distinct tapping on the bedroom window that I realized with a chill that went deep into my bones that whatever was out there wasn't a tree, and it wandered in my name, Daniel. The cabin was exactly as advertised, a comfortable two-bedroom log home nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. The closest neighbor was miles away, and the dirt road leading to the property had been rough enough to make us second-guess our choice several times, but as soon as we got out of the car, the fresh mountain air and the complete silence took away our doubts. If only we had known what was waiting for us in those woods. As we stood on the porch, an older man named Bill gave us the keys and gave us a quick tour. I couldn't help but notice how his eyes darted nervously around, never quite settling on one spot. Now, a few things to keep in mind are that there is a lot of wildlife out there and it's easy to get lost, so don't go wandering in the woods after dark. If you hear any strange noises at night, just ignore them. They're probably just raccoons or something. I nodded, not giving it much thought at the time. Bill added a warning to the door, saying, "Whatever you do, don't open the doors or windows at night, no matter what you hear, get it?" Before we could ask him what he meant, he left, his truck kicking up dust as he sped down the dirt road. Emily and I exchanged glances, and she said, "Well, that was weird," laughing nervously. I shrugged it off, assuming he was just trying to scare the city folk. The rest of the day went perfectly. We hiked a nearby trail, prepared dinner on the old wood stove, and spent the evening together. Until we were getting ready for bed, I didn't notice the scratches until we were inside the doors and around the windows. They were long, deep gouges in the wood that appeared to have been made by something with very sharp claws. "Come look at this," I called out, and she came over, frowning, running her fingers over the marks. "It's strange, like a bear trying to get in or something." Perhaps I said something about the scratches, but it made my eyes water. We went to bed making jokes about ghost bears to lighten the mood, but as the night went on and the scratching began, those jokes ceased to seem funny. I lay there with all of my muscles tense, listening to the sound move around the cabin. Scratch, scratch, pause, scratch, scratch, pause, PA. Then the tapping on the window as if something was testing the glass, Emily stirring next to me. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, not believing my voice, and we clung to each other, barely breathing as the tapping went from window to after what seemed like hours, it stopped, and we finally fell into an uncomfortable sleep as dawn started to break. The following morning, we tried to explain what had happened by arguing that it was raccoons or perhaps a particularly persistent owl. We spent the day hiking and swimming in a nearby lake, the bright sunshine making the night's terrors seem far away and silly. However, as evening approached and we got back to the cabin, that uneasiness returned, so we checked all the locks, pulled the curtains tight, and tried to divert our attention. I wanted to reassure her that it was just the wind or our imaginations playing tricks on us. But as the not-quite voice grew louder and formed sounds that were almost words, I couldn't tell her or myself. We huddled together on the bed. The scratching began earlier that night, more insistent than before, and this time it was accompanied by something else. A low guttural sound that was almost but not quite a voice. "Daniel," Emily whispered, making her face pale in the lamplight. We kept circling the cabin, watching the shadows beneath the door, and listening to whatever was outside. At one point, something heavy threw itself against the front door, causing the entire cabin to shudder. I considered running for the car, but the keys were in the living room, and it seemed impossible to open any doors, so we waited, holding on to each other, as the night went on forever. Just before dawn, in that darkest hour, when hope seemed the furthest away, we heard a new sound, footsteps on the porch. We cautiously approached the door, and through the peephole, I saw Bill, the cabin owner, standing on the porch with a flashlight. I opened the door and felt a wave of relief wash over me. "Thank God. There's something out here," Bill said, pushing past us into the cabin. "I know that's why I'm here, you too," he said, still shaking. We nodded, still shaken. Bill quickly walked around the cabin, checking the windows and doors, and when he was satisfied, he turned to us. "I owe you an apology," he said grimly, adding, "I should have told you the whole truth when you got here, but I was afraid you'd leave, and I need the money if I'm being honest." "What the hell is going on here?" Bill sighed, suddenly looking much older. "This land isn't right," he said. "Because it's not as long as I remember things living in these woods that aren't natural. But sometimes, especially when there's new blood around, they get curious." "What kind of things?" He shook his head. "I've never seen them up close, but I've heard him feel them watching. They're smart, whatever they are, and they're hungry." "Why don't you leave?" Emily asked. "Can't Bill just say this land's been in my family for generations?" He also added, his voice falling to a near whisper, "I don't think they'd let me." We sat in the living room listening to Bill's stories about the creatures that lived in the woods. Disappeared over the years of nights when it seemed like the lines separating our world from something else were thinning. As the sun rose and cast long shadows through the trees, Bill got up and said, "They'll be gone now. They can't stand the daylight. You two should pack up and go. I'll refund your money." We didn't argue, and an hour later we were driving down the mountain road with the cabin fading in our rearview mirror. We didn't discuss what had happened that weekend much, and we couldn't explain it to anyone, not even to ourselves. I found it simpler to let the memory fade and concentrate on our typical, secure lives in the city, but occasionally on dark nights when the wind is blowing just right, I find myself listening for that scratching sound, and in my dreams, I still hear that voice calling from just beyond the walls, trying to form words I hope I never understand. I have no idea what would have happened if it had gotten inside those woods, why it was so interested in us, or what it might have done if it had. If you ever find yourself in a remote cabin miles from civilization and you hear a scratching at the door or a tapping at the window, remember my story. Keep the doors locked, the curtains drawn, and whatever you do, don't let it in, because once you acknowledge those things in the dark, once you let them know you can hear them, they'll never stop calling, and eventually curiosity, fear, or just plain tiredness might lead you to answer. "I need help. I'm at the old Starlight truck. Something's coming back. Oh God, please hurry." Then nothing but dead air. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, and stared out at the empty highway stretching before me. The logical part of my brain told me to ignore it to keep the peace, but some calls are better left unanswered. Some doors are meant to stay closed, and some woods are best left unexplored, no matter how inviting they might seem in the light of day. With a muttered curse, I flipped on my turn signal and took the next exit, not realizing that it would send me into a nightmare that I'm still trying to comprehend. My name is Mike Callahan, and I've been hauling freight across the country since I was old enough to obtain my CDL. I've seen my share of strange things out on the lonely highways, ghost lights. However, 20 years of driving had taught me one thing. Sometimes a trucker is all that stands between a stranger and disaster in the vast emptiness of the American night. It was a normal run from Seattle to Miami with a trailer full of electronics, and I was having a great time as the miles melted away under my wheels as I cruised through the New Mexico desert. The radio kept me company with a mix of old country tunes and the occasional chatter from other truckers. It was just after 2 a.m. unknown weather patterns, even what some might call UFOs, but nothing in all my years prepared me for what I encountered that night at the abandoned Starlight truck stop. I initially assumed that the distress call was just some kids playing on the channel, but something in that voice, the raw fear and desperation, made me reconsider. I tried to reply to get more information, but all I got was that eerie step static. I knew the Starlight, a popular stop in the past that was a little oasis of neon and greasy food in the middle of nowhere. But it had closed years ago and was now just a crumbling relic slowly being reclaimed. It wouldn't be the first time someone tried to entice a trucker off the main road with a phony distress call. But I couldn't get rid of the image of that scared voice. If someone was truly in trouble out here, they had few options for help. The old access road was little more than a pair of tire tracks, now weeds growing up through cracks in the asphalt. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating scrub brush and the occasional piece of wind-blown debris. The Starlight truck stop was in worse shape than I remembered. The once happy neon sign was dark. Most of its tubes were broken. The main building's windows were boarded up, and half of the roof had collapsed. The large parking lot, which had once been full of rigs from all over the country, was now deserted save for tumbleweeds and broken glass. I pulled up in front of the main entrance, leaving my engine running, and the only sounds in the eerie silence were the settling creak and the settling noise. When I heard a distress call on the CB, there was no echo, so I grabbed my flashlight from the cab and cautiously approached the building. The boards over the main doors had been pried away, leaving a dark maw that seemed to swallow my light. Every instinct told me to get back in my truck and drive away, but I couldn't get rid of the memory of that desperate voice. What if someone was hurt in there? To call out, I entered the area illuminated by my flashlight, which revealed a scene of decay and desolation. Overturned tables, broken plates, and layers of dust covered everything. It appeared as though scavengers had cleaned the area years ago. "Hello?" I called again, my voice resonating in the empty room. I heard a scraping sound coming from the back of the building, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. "Hey, you, okay?" I moved in the direction of the sound, my heart racing as I turned the corner into a CB radio. Propped up against an old stove in what used to be the kitchen, caught my flashlight beam and made my blood run cold. It looked brand new and completely out of place in the decaying ruins surrounding it. I approached slowly, my mind racing with questions like, has the person who called for help left this here? And why and where were they now? When I noticed something else on the floor around the radio, I took a step back and became acutely aware of how silent it was. Even the wind seemed to have subsided, and then I heard a low, guttural sound coming from somewhere behind me. It was almost a voice, but not quite, and as I slowly turned around, I noticed something in the doorway. In the moment before terror took over, my mind attempted to make sense of what I was seeing. It was vaguely humanoid but too tall and thin, with limbs bent at impossible angles and a face that was, God, just a blank expanse of pale skin with a mouth that split it. The last thing I remember is the CB radio crackling to life, that same desperate voice calling out for help, and I woke up in my truck parked on the side of the highway. I would like to say that I fought, or at least that I had the mental capacity to run, but the truth is that I froze, rooted to the spot as that thing unfolded itself, growing taller as it flowed into the room like smoke given form. It reached for me with hands that were more like claws, and I felt my consciousness slipping away. It had all been a vivid nightmare, but then I saw the dust on my clothes, the scratches on my arms, and the CB radio from the abandoned truck stop on the passenger seat. My logbook revealed that I had lost nearly 6 hours, 6 hours that I could not remember. I drove to the closest town in a day, checked into a motel, and tried to figure out what had happened. Had I actually seen what I thought I saw, or had my mind created some unthinkable horror to fill in the blanks? I considered calling the police, but what would I say? that a ghost on the CBE had lured me to an abandoned truck stop and that a monster had attacked me, saying that if they didn't lock me up for my own safety, they would laugh me out of the station. In the end, I did the only thing I could do and I got back on the road and completed my run, but after that night, I started taking routes that avoided long stretches of empty highway, even if it meant longer trips. And that CB radio I couldn't bring myself to get. I've tried to learn more about the Starlight truck stop since then, and it turns out that it has a long history of disappearances dating back decades. Truckers stopped there and were never seen again, and there are local legends about ancient burial grounds and doorways to other worlds. I'm not sure what to believe anymore. I can't stand to have it in my truck either. It's now wrapped in chains and locked in a box, and some nights I swear I can hear it calling in that same desperate voice, pleading for help. If you're ever driving late at night and you hear a desperate voice on the CB pleading for help, think twice before you answer, because sometimes the call for help isn't coming from someone in trouble, sometimes it's coming from the trouble itself. I know this because there are things out there in the dark that we can't explain, things that lurk on the edges of our world waiting for someone to answer their call. As for me, I still drive, but never at night if I can avoid it, and I keep my CV turned off no matter how lonely the road gets, because I know now that some calls are better left unanswered and some mysteries are best left unsolved. The first thing I noticed when I stepped out onto the porch was that an abandoned truck stopped in the middle of the New Mexico desert. Keep driving, don't look back, and don't stop doing anything you do, because you never know what might be waiting there in the darkness, ready to drag you into a nightmare you might never wake up from. Then I saw a huge, intricate pattern carved into my wheat field, the stalks bent and woven with impossible precision. In that moment, as the rising sun cast long shadows across the design, I knew my life would never be the same. I didn't know how deep the rabbit hole went or how dangerous the truth would turn out to be. The morning was a time of silence, without bird song, distant cattle, or even the rustle of wind through the cornfields. Since my great-grandfather first laid this land in the 1890s, it has been in my family for generations and has been passed down from father to son. I have witnessed droughts, floods, and everything in between, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that summer. It began innocently enough one night when a few of my cows got frightened and stampeded across the north pasture, which is unusual but not unheard of. Then my tractor started acting up, the electronics going haywire for no apparent reason. We're pretty isolated out here. The closest neighbor is 5 miles down the road. I was up late reviewing some paperwork in the kitchen when I noticed a flash of light outside. At first, I thought it was headlights from a passing car, but then I noticed 3 bright orbs of light hovering silently over my wheat field. The lights appeared for an apparent reason again, which was annoying, but nothing too unusual for aging farm equipment. For what seemed like hours but was probably only a few minutes, I stood frozen as they pulsed with an unearthly glow that cast long shadows across the swaying stalks. Then, as abruptly as they appeared, the lights shot straight up into the sky and disappeared. I told myself that I was tired, that perhaps I had fallen asleep at the kitchen table and dreamed the entire thing, but deep down I knew what I was seeing was real. For the next few nights, I stayed up watching, but the lights didn't come back. Just when I was beginning to believe I had imagined it all, I woke up to find that the wheat stalks were bent but not broken, woven together in a way that defied explanation. The crop circle was enormous, occupying almost half of my 100-acre wheat field. The design was extremely complex, consisting of a series of interlocking circles and crescents that seemed to spiral out from a central point. I called the sheriff more out of obligation than genuine hope for answers. Bob has been a friend for years, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes as he assessed the damage. He suggested that it might be pranksters. Very convinced, you know how kids get in the summer looking for thrills. I shook my head, Bob. This would have taken a team of people all night to complete, and they would have left tracks. If you look at the ground, you won't find a single footprint or tire track anywhere. He didn't have an answer for that. Word spread quickly, as they usually do in small towns, and by noon, my driveway was jammed with curious people. I tried my best to keep them off my property, but it was like trying to stop the tide. When things started to get really weird, it started with the animals. My dogs, who were normally friendly, started acting aggressively and snarling at anyone who approached the crop circle. The cattle also refused to graze anywhere near that field, instead congregating at the far end of their pasture and yelling uncomfortably all night long. Next, the equipment started to malfunction, not just my tractor, but all of the farm's electronic devices. Cell phones died minutes after they were fully charged, and the TV occasionally emitted only static. Every night, I would find myself wandering through that wheat field with the stalks whispering and singing around me in voices just on the edge of understanding. Things were always just ahead of me, always just out of sight, and I would wake up in a cold sweat with the taste of metal in my mouth and the feeling that I was about to understand something vast and terrible. These dreams were broken up by what sounded like voices speaking in an unknown language. Mr. Harper, who identified himself as Dr. Alan Fredman, an astrophysicist from the State University, was quieter and more serious than the other investigators who had come sniffing around. He said, "Have you noticed any other unusual phenomena since this appeared? Lights in the sky perhaps, or electronic disturbances?" The hair on the back of my neck stood up. He turned to face me, and his expression was grave because this isn't the first time this has happened. There is a pattern. "Mister," he said in a low voice, "that these are some sort of test sites and that whatever intelligence is behind this is preparing for something bigger. Harper, these events are getting worse over the next few hours." Dr. Fredman told me things that really got to me. He told me about other crop circles that all had a similar design and had appeared across the country over the past few years, about increased UFO sightings in those areas, and about people who had gone missing, always in the weeks after the appearance of a circle. Dr. Fredman shook his head, saying, "We don't know, but we think you might be in danger, Mr. Harper. These sites seem to have a strange effect on those closest to them. We've documented cases of people claiming to receive messages or orders from an unknown source." As he spoke, I felt a chill run down my spine and thought of my dreams of the whispers. I was on the verge of understanding what they wanted, but I couldn't handle the crazy talk. The following few days were a flurry of activity as Dr. Fredman and his team set up cameras and sensors around the perimeter of the crop circle. They collected soil samples and heard each other whispering sweetly in worried tones, and throughout it all, the whispers in my dreams grew. He said, "Whatever you do, don't enter that field, no matter what you hear, no matter what you think, see." All of this culminated on the 7th night after the circle appeared. I was startled awake by a sound I had never heard before, a low thrumming vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I staggered to the window and felt my heart stop. I would wake up with strange symbols etched in my mind, my fingers itching to draw them, and the urge to walk into that field to reach the center of the circle became nearly overwhelming. I don't remember choosing to go outside. One minute I was at the window, and the next I was running across the yard in my pajamas, pulled toward the circle by a force that made it impossible for me to resist. Dr. Friedman's warning echoed in my mind, but it seemed far away and irrelevant, and all that mattered was getting to the center of the circle and meeting whatever was coming down from the sky. I was at the edge of the wheat field. When a hand seized my arm and pulled me back, it was Dr. Friedman. His face was pale in the unearthly light. Harper warned, and he yelled over the thrumming, "If you go in there, we'll lose you." I fought against his hold, the whispers in my head drowning out everything else, but he held firm, and gradually, painfully, I felt the compulsion start to fade. We watched in awe as the lights descended into the center of the crop circle. There was a flash so bright it left spots dancing in my vision, and then nothing. The lights were gone, and the thrumming stopped the crop. In the days that followed, government agents surrounded my farm, dug up the crop circle, tested and retested every grain of soil, and interrogated me for hours. Dr. Fredman and his team found nothing, no radiation, no unexplained elements, nothing to prove that anything unusual had happened. The official story changed to that it was a complex hoax, even though there was no evidence to support that theory. However, I know what I saw and I know what I felt. 5 years have passed since that night. I still farm the land, but things have changed. No matter what we plant on quiet nights, I sometimes feel like I can still hear those whispers on the edge of my mind, and sometimes when I look up at the stars, I can't get rid of the feeling that something is watching and waiting up there. I'm not sure what would have happened if I had reached the center of that circle. I'm not sure what's coming or when, but I do know that we are not alone and that the universe is stranger and more terrifying. The coffee cup was still warm, and that's what got me, not the eerie silence, not the abandoned cars, not even the new tire tracks leading nowhere, but that paper cup in the trash with steam still rising from its contents that made my skin crawl. If you ever see lights in the sky that move like nothing you've ever seen before, or if you ever find a strange pattern carved into your fields, remember my story. No matter what you do, don't answer when they call, because once you do, there's no turning back. My name is Alex, and I've been driving cross-country for the better part of 10 years. Long-haul trucking isn't glamorous, but it pays the bills and satisfies my wanderlust. I've seen my share of strange things on the road. Last but not least, the rest stop was empty as I stood there, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, and a figure watched at the edge of the woods. Nothing at all prepared me for what I saw that night at the Pinewood rest stop. It was a routine run from St. Louis to Portland with a trailer full of electronics, and I had been working hard to make up time after a delay at my last stop. The night was moonless, and the highway was a ribbon of black stretching endlessly before me. I had been fighting sleep for the last hour, and my eyes were gritty and my mind was fuzzy when I saw the mysterious lights in the sky, ghost towns that aren't on any map, and what some might call supernatural occurrences. When I saw the rest stop sign, I nearly burst out in tears of relief. I told myself that I would only need to take a quick break, splash some water on my face, grab a coffee, and be fine for a few more hours. The rest stop was one of those older ones with a small building with restrooms and vending machines and a separate area for trucks to park. As I pulled in, I saw a few cars in the lot, but no one was there. I parked and got out of my rig, stretching my sore muscles from sitting for hours. The air was strangely. I went to the building, my footsteps resonating loudly on the concrete, the door creaking as I pushed it open, the sound jarring in the quiet, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly, casting a harsh glare over the empty space. I headed for the men's room, splashing cold water on my face and letting it run down my neck, and as I looked up at my reflection, haggard and pale in the mirror, I noticed something that made my eyes go wide. I saw a glimpse of movement in the mirror reflected in the partially open door behind me. It was only a shadow, but it was definitely human-shaped. I spun around, but the doorway was empty. I called out, sounding thin and nervous even to my own ears, but I got no response. I dismissed it as a trick of my exhausted mind. I left the restroom and made my way to the vending machines when I noticed the other oddities. A jacket draped over a chair as though its owner had just stepped away. A smartphone on my skin tingled with goosebumps as I stepped back outside and looked around the parking lot, seeing that the cars I had seen earlier were still there, some with their doors hanging open. I went to the closest one, a blue sedan, the keys in the ignition, the engine ticking as it cooled. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice echoing across the empty lot. "Anyone here?" The silence that answered was deafening, and that's when I noticed the tire tracks, fresh ones coming from one of the parking spaces and coming to a sudden stop at the edge of the lot as though the car had just disappeared into thin air. My heart was racing, and adrenaline was now clearing the fog of exhaustion from my head, but something was seriously wrong. I turned with the intention of running back to my truck and leaving right away, but then I noticed the figure at the edge of the woods. It was human-shaped, but it was too tall and thin, and its proportions weren't quite right. It stood motionless, half hidden behind a tree, and I caught my breath. For a long time, neither of us moved in its gaze like a rabbit before a wolf, but then slowly it raised a hand, beckoning. Fear shook me like an electric shock, and I ran back to my truck with a speed I didn't know I had. I fumbled with the keys, cursing as I dropped them, and scurried in the gravel to get them back. As I pulled myself up into the cab, I took a chance and looked back. The figure was closer now, no longer hiding behind the trees and glare from the rest stop lights. As I slammed the truck into gear, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. More figures emerged from the woods, dozens of them with the same impossible physiology, all moving with an unnatural, fluid grace. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched too tight over an impossible frame, and its face was smooth and featureless except for deep-set eyes that reflected the light like a cat's, and its mouth, which split its face from ear to ear full of needle-sharp teeth. I drove for hours, pushing well over the legal limit for consecutive time behind the wheel until the sun was high in the sky and I was 2 states away. Even then, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I was being watched. When I finally plucked up the courage to check my mirrors, the highway behind me was deserted with no sign of pursuit and no indication of the horror I'd left behind. The truck's tires were spinning in the gravel before finding purchase, and I ripped out of that rest stop as if all the demons of hell were pursuing me. However, the images of those beckoning hand figures were ingrained in my memory. I thought about telling someone what I had seen, but who would believe me? I would sound like a crazy person talking about monsters at a rest stop, so I kept quiet, finished my run, and tried to tell myself that it had all been a hallucination caused by exhaustion, but I couldn't help but think about the people at the rest stop. The ones who had abandoned their cars and possessions, the ones who had followed the beckoning hand into there were whispered tales among long-haul truckers and late-night travelers about rest stops where people disappeared without a trace. About figures seen at the edge of the woods always at night, always beckoning. Some called them aliens, others said they were interdimensional beings, and some spoke of ancient forgotten gods awakening in the woods. I dug a little, but it wasn't easy because I'm no detective and I had very little to go on. In our contemporary world, I have no idea who they are or what they want, but I know that they are waiting at the edges of desolate highways in the shadow of late-night rest stops. I continue to drive, but never at night if at all possible, pushing myself to drive from one large town to the next without stops, and I never, ever stop if I see a lone figure standing at the edge of the woods. Sometimes on long hauls when it is dark and the road seems to go on forever. I believe I see them in my mirrors as tall, thin figures. If you're ever driving late at night and you see a rest stop appear out of the darkness, think twice before you stop. Check your gas gauge, your caffeine levels, and your fatigue, and ask yourself if it's worth the risk, because you never know what might be waiting there in the shadows. I sometimes wonder if I really did escape that night, or if I'm still there, trapped in some in-between place, living out a life that's not quite real. The first picture showed nothing but trees, the second showed a blur of movement at the edge of the frame, but the third made my blood run cold because it showed a figure emerging from the shadows between 2 ancient pines. It beckoned you into the woods, and once you followed it, you might never find your way back. Remember my story and keep driving no matter how tired you are, because some rest stops aren't meant for rest. Some are gateways to places we were never meant to go, and once you cross that threshold, there's no turning back. Humanoid but incorrect in some way, it was too tall and thin, its proportions warped in a way that went against the laws of nature, and it was staring straight at the camera as I lowered the viewfinder with trembling hands. Night was falling, and I realized that I was no longer alone in these woods. My name is Maggie Chin, and I have been a nature photographer for almost 10 years. I have scaled mountains, waded through swamps, and trekked through rainforests in an attempt to capture the ideal shot, but nothing has ever. I had done dozens of trips like this before, and I was looking forward to the solitude of being in nature without the distractions of the modern world. The first few days were idyllic. The forest was a photographer's dream, with towering evergreens draped in the background. Experience could have prepared me for what I encountered in the depths of the Olympic National Forest. It was supposed to be a routine assignment, a two-person solo expedition to capture the raw beauty of the old-growth forest for a conservation magazine. I set up my base camp in a small clearing near a babbling stream, surrounded by moss with dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. I ventured out every day to explore and take pictures, but on the fourth night, things started to get weird. I was looking through my camera's day shots when I noticed a strange shape in the background of one picture, barely visible in the shadows between two trees. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light or possibly a deer, but something about it bothered me the next day. I set up my camera trap, a motion-activated camera made to capture wildlife, and left it there for the day while I explored other areas. When I returned that evening and checked the camera, my heart almost stopped because there were dozens of images taken in rapid succession. The first few showed nothing unusual, just the forest floor and a squirrel or two, but then the figure appeared, tall and impossibly thin with long, spindly limbs that seemed to its face was smooth and featureless, save for two large dark eyes that reflected the camera's flash like a cat's, and its skin, where visible, was pale and almost translucent, stretched tight over an inhuman frame. I stared at the pictures, refusing to believe what I was seeing. It couldn't be real, it had to be a hoax, a trick pulled by a hiker with too much free time and a knack for Photoshop. However, as I scrolled through the series of pictures, a shiver went down my spine because the figure was moving. I packed up my belongings with trembling hands and practically ran back to my campsite that night, barely sleeping at first, starting at every snapping twig and rustle of leaves. I told myself I was being silly, that there had to be a logical explanation, but deep down I knew what I'd seen was real. The following morning, I woke up to find my campsite in disarray, my backpack emptied, its contents scattered about, my food cache hung. It was getting closer to the camera with each shot in the final image, reaching towards the lens with long fingers blurred with motion. My heart almost stopped when I turned on my camera and looked at the most recent pictures. There were new pictures of me sleeping inside my tent that were visible through the mesh window, and in each one, that figure was there, getting closer and closer than I should have. The rope that had been torn down to protect it from bears had snapped like thread, and there was a footprint pressed into a patch of soft earth near my tent, long and narrow, with toes that looked more like claws. Left, packed up, and hiked out. Assignment be damned, but a mix of curiosity, stubbornness, and plain old stupidity kept me there. I told myself that if I could just get a better picture and figure out what this thing was, then everything would make sense, so I stayed, and every night the creature got closer. I set up more camera traps around my campsite, taking pictures of it as it circled my tent. I hardly slept, spending my nights curled up in my sleeping bag, gripping my hunting knife, and jumping at every sound during. As the days went by, I started to feel as though I was going crazy. The forest, which had once been lovely and inviting, now seemed menacing. The trees towered over me, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers, and I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I was being watched. One day, I ventured out following trails of broken branches and those strange footprints, and I discovered places where the undergrowth had been crushed as if something large had beat it down. Once I found a tuft of hair caught on a branch, coarse and gray like no animal fur I'd ever seen. I had planned to hike out in the morning, my assignment finished, and my sanity hanging by a thread. I had set up my cameras for one last night of observation, hoping against hope for that one clear shot that would prove I wasn't crazy. I must have dozed off despite my fear, because I woke up suddenly in the pitch black of my tent. Something had changed. Even in broad daylight, I stayed because my need to understand and document what I was seeing had become an obsession. I lay there paralyzed with terror as the forest's constant sounds, the rustle of leaves, the chirp of insects, had stopped, and I could hear something outside my tent moving softly but unmistakably, circling and sniffing. Then, to my horror, I saw my tent's zipper start to move slowly, inch by agonizing inch, widening the opening of my tent. I wanted to scream, run, or do anything, but my body wouldn't react, so I could only watch, eyes wide in the darkness, as a long, pale hand with too many joints slipped through the opening. And the hand hesitated as if sensing my fear before purposefully reaching for my camera, which was next to my sleeping bag. With survival instinct finally taking over, I lunged for the camera and snatched it from that awful hand. In the same motion, I kicked out at the tent wall, tearing through the fabric, and fell into the night. I ran blindly and desperately, clutching the camera to my chest, stumbling over branches that were whipping at my face. I don't know how long I ran or how far my lungs burned, but fear kept me going. Eventually, mercifully, I saw lights ahead of the ranger station at the trailhead, a beacon of civilization in the wilderness. I burst out of the tree line, gasping and sobbing, and the startled ranger on duty took one look at my wild eyes and torn clothing before ushered me inside and locking the door behind us. The rest of that night is a nightmare. Blur, I recall telling my story, and the ranger's doubtful expressions changed to worry when he saw the unadulterated fear in my eyes. I recall the police coming to take my statement, and I recall the moment they asked to see my camera, which I turned on and started to scroll through the pictures. However, instead of the dozens of pictures of that otherworldly being, there were only trees, shadows, and typical forest scenes, including the ones from that last night that I was certain I had taken. Of the hand reaching into my tent was gone, and the harsh fluorescent light of the ranger station made everything seem like a bad dream. I thought that 2 weeks of being alone in the deep woods had driven me to some sort of breakdown, but then I noticed, in the last picture on the camera, a tall, thin figure half hidden behind a tree, and even though it was blurry, I could swear it was grinning. I've never returned to those woods, and I've never told when the wind whispers through the trees outside my window on dark nights. I sometimes find myself thinking about what's out there in the deep woods, about the things that lurk just beyond the reach of our cameras and our understanding, and I wonder with a chill that goes bone deep if it's still out there watching. The full story was watered down for everyone but you, my editor, about being spooked by wildlife. The photos I submitted were carefully chosen to show nothing but the natural beauty of the forest. Some things in this world are not meant to be photographed, so if you're ever in the wilderness setting up your camera for that ideal shot of untouched nature, pay attention to the shadows between the trees. If you see something moving there that doesn't quite fit, don't try to take a picture of it. Instead, run and don't look back. Once they notice you noticing them, they never forget, they never stop watching, and eventually they come. It was a living, breathing woman who could have been my twin. Our eyes met across the crowded dining room, and I felt a chill go down my spine as she smiled and waved. I knew with sickening certainty that my peaceful Caribbean cruise had just taken a turn into uncharted waters. For you, the first time I saw her, I thought I was looking in a mirror with the same shoulder-length brown hair, green eyes, and even the same tiny scar above my left eyebrow from a childhood accident. I'm a 32-year-old software engineer from Seattle, and until that point, I had been enjoying a much-needed vacation aboard the Majestic Dream, a luxury cruise liner sailing through the turquoise waters of the Caribbean. This was my first real vacation in years, and I had been looking forward to 10 days of sun relaxation and, if I was lucky, a little romance. The first few days had been everything I had hoped for. I had lounged by the pool, indulged in far too many fruity cocktails, and even flirted with a cute guy named Everything Changed for Mike, who was traveling with a group of friends. On the fourth night at the captain's dinner, I was dressed up for the event, wearing a new blue dress I had purchased especially for the cruise, and as I entered the grand dining room, I noticed myself in one of the large decorative mirrors. I stopped to straighten my hair, which is when I first saw her. At first, I thought it was just my reflection from a different angle, but when I turned to face her, I was shocked to discover that she was a distinct individual, who, down to the smallest detail, looked exactly like me. For a brief moment, the busy dining room seemed to disappear as she waved and smiled as if we were old friends. I felt stationary and my mind was spinning. This couldn't be real. It had to be some sort of elaborate prank or a very vivid hallucination. A waiter bumped into me, breaking the spell, and by the time I turned around, she had vanished into the sea of diners heading to their tables during dinner, and I was unable to concentrate on the conversation at my table. As the night wore on, I couldn't get rid of the uneasiness that had settled over me. Who was she, and why did she look exactly like me? The following morning, I was determined to find her and get some answers, so I wandered around for hours. I had once seen her sitting at a table across the room, but when I blinked, she was gone again. "Sarah, are you okay?" Mike's voice brought me back to the present. "You look like you've seen a ghost," so I had to laugh. "I'm a little tired, I suppose that's all." I was heading back to my cabin to get ready for dinner when I caught a glimpse of her turning a corner at the end of the hallway. I broke into a run, but when I rounded the corner, the corridor was empty that night, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face smiling at me across the dining room at around 2 a.m. The ship was checking every restaurant lounge and deck, but there was no sign of her. I didn't see her again until late afternoon. I decided to give up sleep and go for a walk to get my mind straightened out. The ship was eerily quiet as I walked through the empty hallways. I found myself leaning against the railing on one of the upper decks, staring out at the moonlit ocean when I heard soft but distinct footsteps behind me. I turned, half expecting to see my double, but instead I saw Mike, who looked surprised to see me. "What are you doing up so late?" I hesitated, then I decided to take a chance. "Mike, I know this sounds crazy, but have you seen anyone on the ship that looks like me?" "Like me?" He frowned and looked perplexed. "What do you mean?" I told him everything about seeing my doppelganger at dinner and about pursuing her through the ship. As I spoke, I could see the worry growing in his eyes. "Sarah," he said gently. "Maybe you should speak to the ship's doctor," he said after I finished. "I think maybe you should talk to the ship's doctor. Stress can do funny things to a person's mind, and I'm not crazy." "I'm sorry, but I just know what I saw, Mike. She's real. Believe me, if there is someone on the ship who actually looks that much like you, other people must have noticed too." We decided to meet for breakfast, and I was thankful for his support even though he may have thought I was going crazy. That night, I dreamed of endless hallways lined with mirrors, each of which displayed a slightly different version of myself. I woke up panting and drenched in sweat, and the following few days were a blur of paranoia. Mike and I interrogated other passengers, looked through passenger lists, and even bought a junior crew member to allow us to view security camera footage, but there was no sign of my enigmatic double. As I passed, I heard whispers and saw people pointing and speaking in low voices. More than once, someone came up to me and insisted that they had just seen me in a different area of the ship. Mike stayed by me, but I could tell his patience was running thin, or perhaps that I wanted to believe him, but deep down I knew what I'd seen, and I was growing increasingly convinced that something very strange was happening on this ship. It all came to a head on the 8th night of the cruise when I was walking back to my cabin after a late-night movie and I saw her again. She was standing at the end of the corridor, watching me, and this time I was determined not to let her leave, so I ran. "Was just someone who looked a lot like you," he suggested one afternoon while we were sitting by the pool, "and now you're just seeing what you expected to see." Calling out to her, "Wait, who are you, and why do you look like me?" She turned and ran away, and I followed her through the ship's winding hallways upstairs, through lounges, and through restaurants. It was like a maze, and I kept running into areas of the ship I had never seen before. Eventually, I cornered her in a dead-end hallway and she stood with her back to me, her shoulders heaving as though she had been running too. I gasped, "Just tell me who you are," and she slowly turned to face me. She said, "I'm you, Sarah, or rather I'm who you could be, who you might become," and her voice was a warped version of mine. I stumbled backward, my back hitting the wall, and she took a step towards me. Her face was mine, but something was off. Her proportions were a little off, her eyes were a little too large, and her smile was a little too wide. As I watched in horror, her features seemed to ripple and shift like a reflection in disturbed water. She laughed, and the sound sent shivers down my spine. "To give you a choice, of course, you can return to your life, your safe, predictable existence, or you can embrace the unknown and become something more." As she spoke, I noticed something behind her. The end of the hallway was shifting, shimmering like a heat haze, and beyond. She said, "This ship exists in a place where realities intersect, where different versions of ourselves can meet." I was tempted by the promise of adventure and the unknown, but then I thought of my life back home with my friends and family, and Mike probably worried about where I disappeared to. I shook my head, saying, "No, this is my reality, my life, and I chose it." Her face was twisted in anger, becoming less and less human the second. "You'll regret this." Before I could react, she lunged at me. There were glimpses of other places and realities. I thought it had all been a dream until I saw something on my bedside table, a small silver pendant shaped like a key. I had never seen it before, but it looked oddly familiar. I picked it up, and as I did, I felt a rush of wind and a sensation of falling, but it never came. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my cabin, sunlight streaming through the porthole, and the sounds of passengers enjoying the morning filtered in from the hallway. The rest of the crew passed without incident, and I eventually convinced myself that stress and too much sun had influenced my thoughts. Mike and I grew closer, and by the time we docked, we were planning to see each other again in the real world. But occasionally late at night, I find myself staring at that silver key and wondering about roads not taken, about other people. I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror for a brief moment, and I could have sworn my reflection smiled at me with a mouth that was a little too wide. If you ever find yourself on a cruise and catch a glimpse of someone who looks exactly like you, remember my story and carefully consider the choices you make, because sometimes our doubles are more than just reflections. Sometimes they're glimpses of who we might become, for better or for worse. I can't help but think that somewhere out there on a ship sailing through the spaces between worlds, another Sarah made a very different choice. The weathered trucker who had said them was already gone, leaving me frozen in my seat, half-eaten, the burger getting cold on the plate in front of me. I looked at my watch at 11:37 p.m., and I felt my blood turn to ice. Whatever you do, don't be here at midnight. I knew with increasing dread that I had wandered into something considerably more sinister than a late-night pit break as I surveyed the cafe, taking in the tight expressions and sly glances of the other customers. My name is Jack, and up until that point, I had been following a pattern. I'm a freelance photographer, and I had accepted a last-minute job that required me to ship some delicate equipment that shipping companies couldn't trust. The pay was good, and I thought the road trip would allow me to take some interesting pictures along the way. I'd been driving for almost 18 hours straight, driven by coffee from the gas station and the kind of determination that comes only from an impending deadline, when I noticed the neon sign for Mel's Diner shining brightly in the sky. The diner looked like something out of a 1950s postcard, with chrome and red vinyl booths and a jukebox in the corner playing old rock and roll tunes. However, as soon as I walked in, I sensed something was off. The place was surprisingly busy for the middle of the night, but the atmosphere was tense, almost electric. I pulled over because my stomach was growling and I thought a hot meal and a real cup of coffee would help. I slid into an empty booth and ordered a cheeseburger and coffee from a while waiting for my food. I noticed that everyone in the diner seemed tense. Conversations were quiet, and people kept looking at the large clock above the counter. When my food arrived, I tried to start a conversation with the waitress, but she nodded and her eyes darted to the clock. Yes, it usually is around this time, but she hesitated and then leaned in closer. "You seem nice, honey," she said. "So let me give you some advice." The trucker behind the counter turned to me and whispered those chilling words, "Whatever you do, don't be here at midnight." As he left, I noticed other customers beginning to leave. They moved with an urgency that seemed out of keeping with the late hour, practically running to their cars. I flagged down my waitress again, wondering what was going on and why. "Get back on the road, you don't want to be here too long." Before I could ask what she meant, she was gone, hurrying off to another table. I sat there, completely bewildered. As everyone left, she anxiously looked at the 11:45 p.m. clock. Now, I shouldn't tell you this, but terrible things have been happening here at midnight for years. No one knows why, but some people claim that this place sits on a weak spot between worlds, such as a convergence. All I know is that you don't want to be here when the clock strikes 12. I laughed, even though it sounded hollow to me. "Come on, you can't be serious. Is this place haunted or something?" Her expression remained deadly serious. As I got up to leave, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. The diner's door had disappeared, and where the entrance had been, there was just a solid wall covered in the same tacky wall wallpaper. I wanted to think it was all a complicated joke, some weird local used to scare tourists, but the fear in her eyes and the tension in the air felt too real to dismiss. I gulped down my coffee and threw some bills on the table, deciding that whatever was going on, I didn't want to stay to find out. I blinked frantically throughout the rest of the establishment, certain that I must be more exhausted than I had anticipated. But when I opened my eyes, the wall was still there, and someone whispered. I turned to see the dozen or so other diners still huddled in the middle of the diner, including the waitress, who had lost her composure and was holding a coffee pot like a weapon. I demanded, panic rising in my throat as an elderly man with a face like weathered leather spoke up. "It was midnight, son, or it will be in about 2 minutes. He checked his watch and then they arrived. "Who are you talking about?" But before anyone could respond, the lights started to flicker, and the jukebox, which had been playing Great Balls of Fire quietly, abruptly changed to a slow, discordant melody. I was unaware that the temperature in the diner had dropped several degrees in a matter of seconds. The old man yelled, "Remember not to look directly at them, and whatever you do, don't let them touch you." The waitress pressed a salt shaker, salt, an iron into my hand as we huddled together, circle facing outward without thinking. She muttered only things that slowed them down, and I wanted to laugh and tell them that this was all crazy. But the words died in my throat when I saw something moving outside the windows, shapes darker than the night itself, flowing like smoke, but with a terrible purpose to their movement. They pressed against the glass, which started to frost over despite the desert heat. Someone in our group whimpered, and I felt a hand grab hold of mine and squeeze tight. The old man's voice rose, chanted words in a language I didn't understand, and others joined in, their voices shaking but growing stronger as they repeated the phrases the shadow had spoken. Then, as midnight struck, the real horror started. The shapes outside seemed to decrease, forming vaguely humanoid figures that were somehow more terrifying for their almost recognizable form. They seeped through the cracks around the windows like a noxious gas. Time seemed to stretch and shorten, and I could not tell if we had been surrounded for minutes or hours. Figures circled us, their movements jerky and unnatural. I saw limbs that were too long, faces that changed and shifted like smoke, and the air thick with the smell of ozone and something rotten. Without thinking, one of the creatures reached out towards our group, and I threw the contents of my salt shaker at it. The thing recoiled with a hiss that sounded like radio static, its form dissipating for a moment before reforming. The old man's chanting reached a fever pitch, and the air itself seemed to ripple as the shadow figures started to retreat, their forms becoming less distinct as they flowed back out through the windows that shattered outward in a spray of glass and wind. I was aching from holding it out with the salt shaker ready, and my throat was raw from chanting words I didn't understand. Just when I thought I could take no more, something changed. We stood in stunned silence for a long time as the last remnants of the creatures and the lingering smell of decay were carried through the diner. The only sounds we heard were ragged breathing and the crunch of broken glass beneath our feet. Gradually, our circle broke apart, and I saw tears on some faces and blank shock on others. The waitress was the first to speak, and everyone was okay. There was a general murmur of assent, and no one appeared to have been physically hurt. The diner erupted in activity as if a spell had been broken, with people sweeping up glass, writing, and overturned chairs in an attempt to restore some semblance of normalcy. I stood there, still holding my salt shaker, trying to process what I had just gone through. The old man came up to me, his eyes kind but tired for the first time, saying, "Huh, you did good, son." I found my voice at last. I wish I could tell him that you had been coming here every night for 30 years. But all I know is that there he kept his implication clear as the sun rose, painting the desert in pink and gold hues. The door to the diner reopened, and people started to leave, nodding to one another with the camaraderie of soldiers who had fought together. I walked to my car on wobbly legs, my head still spinning, and as I was ready to drive away, the waitress came out and pressed a piece of paper into my hand. "If you're ever passing through again," she said, "and you want to assist, this is where we'll be." I glanced down at the paper, which contained a schedule with dates and times as well as a list of guardians standing guard against the darkness. As I re-entered the highway, the events of the night started to seem like a dream, but the salt shaker on my passenger seat and the paper I was holding were unquestionable evidence of what I had witnessed. I'm not sure if I'll ever return to that diner, but at the same time, I'm still coming to terms with the fact that since I've seen what's out there and now know what lurks in the gaps between moments, how can I not fight against it? Therefore, if you're ever driving through the Nevada desert late at night and you see a diner glowing like a beacon in the darkness, think carefully before you stop, and if you do, keep an eye on the clock, because when midnight arrives, you might find yourself facing horrors beyond your wildest dreams or standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers, the last line of defense against the encroaching darkness. And no matter what you do, avoid being there at midnight unless you voluntarily choose to be.